Chapter 14 of The Wolf Leader by Alexandre Dumas, translated by Alfred Allinson, 1852 to 1929. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 14. A Village Wedding. He had made but a few steps within the forest when he found himself surrounded by his wolves. He was pleased to see them again. He slackened his pace, he called to them, and the wolves came crowding round him. Thibault caressed them as a shepherd might his sheep, as a keeper of the hounds his dogs. They were his flock, his hunting pack, a flock with flaming eyes, a pack with fine looks. Overhead, among the bare branches, the screech owls were hopping and fluttering, making their plaintive calls, while the other owls uttered their melancholy cries in concert. The eyes of these night birds shone like winged coals flying about among the trees, and there was Thibault in the middle of it all, the centre of the devilish circle. Even as the wolves came up to fawn upon him and crouch at his feet, so the owls appeared to be attracted towards him. The tips of their silent wings brushed against his hair, some of them alighted to perch upon his shoulder. "Ah," murmured Thibault, "I am not then the enemy of all created things. If men hate me, the animals love me." He forgot what place the animals who loved him held in the chain of created beings. He did not remember that these animals which loved him were those which hated mankind, and which mankind cursed. He did not pause to reflect that these animals loved him because he had become among men what they were among animals, a creature of the night, a man of prey. With all these animals together, he could not do an atom of good, but on the other hand, he could do a great deal of harm. Thibault smiled at the thought of the harm he could do. He was still some distance from the home, and he began to feel tired. He knew there was a large hollow oak somewhere near, and he took his bearings and made for it. But he would have missed his way if the wolves, who seemed to guess his thoughts, had not guided him to it. While flocks of owls hopped along from branch to branch as if to illuminate the way, the wolves trotted along in front to show it him. The tree stood about 20 paces back from the road. It was, as I have said, an old oak, numbering not years but centuries. Trees which live 10, 20, 30 times the length of a man's life do not count their age by days and nights, but by seasons. The autumn is their twilight, the winter their night, the spring is their dawn, the summer their day. Man envies the tree, the butterfly envies man. 40 men could not have encircled the trunk of the old oak with their arms. The hollow made by time, that daily dislodged one more little piece of wood with the point of its scythe, was as large as an ordinary sized room, but the entrance to it barely allowed a man to pass through. Thibault crept inside. There he found a sort of seat cut out of the thickness of the trunk, as soft and comfortable to sit in as an armchair. Taking his place in it, and bidding good night to his wolves and his screech owls, he closed his eyes and fell asleep, or at least appeared to do so. The wolves lay down in a circle round the tree, the owls perched in the branches. With these lights spread around its trunk, with these lights scattered about its branches, the oak had the appearance of a tree lit up for some infernal revel. It was broad daylight when Thibault awoke. The wolves had long ago sought their hiding places, the owls flown back to their ruins. The rain of the night before had ceased, and a ray of sunlight, one of those pale rays which are harbinger of spring, came gliding through the naked branches of the trees, and having as yet none of the short-lived verdure of the year to shine upon, lit up the dark green of the mistletoe. From afar came a faint sound of music. Gradually it grew nearer, and the notes of 2 violins and a hautboy could be distinguished. Thibault thought at first that he must be dreaming, but as it was broad daylight and he appeared to be in perfect possession of his senses, he was obliged to acknowledge that he was wide awake. The more so, that having well rubbed his eyes to make quite sure of the fact, the rustic sounds came as distinctly as ever to his ear. They were drawing rapidly nearer. A bird sang, answering the music of man with the music of God, and at the foot of the bush where it sat and made its song, a flower, only a snowdrop it is true, was shining like a star. The sky above was as blue as on April day. What was the meaning of this spring-like festival, now in the heart of winter? The notes of the bird as it sang in salutation of this bright, unexpected day, the brightness of the flower that shone as if with its radiance to thank the sun for coming to visit it, the sounds of merrymaking which told the lost and unhappy man that his fellow creatures were joining with the rest of nature in their rejoicings under the azure canopy of heaven, all the aroma of joy, all this upspringing of happiness, brought no calmer thoughts back to Thibault, but rather increased the anger and bitterness of his feelings. He would have liked the whole world to be as dark and gloomy as was his own soul. On first detecting the sounds of the approaching rural band, he thought of running away from it, but a power, stronger than his will, as it seemed to him, held him rooted to the spot. So he hid himself in the hollow of the oak and waited. Merry voices and lively songs could be heard, mingling with the notes of the violins and hautboy. Now and again a gun went off, or a cracker exploded, and Thibault felt sure that all these festival sounds must be occasioned by some village wedding. He was right, for he soon caught sight of a procession of villagers, all dressed in their best, with long ribbons of many colors floating in the breeze, some from the women's waists, some from the men's hats or buttonholes. They emerged into view at the end of the long lane of Ham. They were headed by fiddlers, then followed a few peasants, and among them some figures which by their livery Thibault recognized as keepers in the service of the Lord of Vez. Then came Engoulevent, the second huntsman, giving his arm to an old blind woman who was decked out with ribbons like the others. Then the major domo of the castle of Vez, as representative probably of the father of the little huntsman, giving his arm to the bride. And the bride herself? Thibault stared at her with wild, fixed eyes. He endeavored, but vainly, to persuade himself that he did not recognize her. It was impossible not to do so when she came within a few paces from where he was hiding. The bride was Agnelette. Agnelette! And to crown his humiliation, as if to give a final blow to his pride, no pale and trembling Agnelette dragged reluctantly to the altar, casting looks behind her of regret or remembrance, but an Agnelette as bright and happy as the bird that was singing, the snowdrop that flowered, the sunlight that was shining. An Agnelette full of delighted pride in her wreath of orange flowers, her tulle veil and muslin dress. An Agnelette, in short, as fair and smiling as the Virgin in the church at Villers-Cotterets, when dressed in her beautiful white dress at Whitsuntide. She was no doubt indebted for all this finery to the lady of the castle, the wife of the Lord of Vez, who was a true lady, bountiful in such matters. But the chief cause of Agnelette's happiness and smiles was not the great love she felt towards the man who was to become her husband, but her contentment at having found what she so ardently desired, that which Thibault had wickedly promised to her without really wishing to give her, someone who would help her to support her blind old grandmother. The musicians, the bride and bridegroom, the young men and maidens passed along the road within 20 paces of Thibault, without observing the head with its flaming hair and the eyes with their fiery gleam, looking out from the hollow of the tree. Then, as Thibault had watched them appear through the undergrowth, so he watched them disappear. As the sounds of the violins and hautboy has gradually become louder and louder, so now they became fainter and fainter, until in another quarter of an hour the forest was as silent and deserted as ever, and Thibault was left alone with his singing bird, his flowering snowdrop, his glittering ray of sunlight. But a new fire of hell had been lighted in his heart, the worst of the fires of hell, that which gnaws at the vitals like the sharpest serpent's tooth, and corrodes the blood like the most destructive poison, the fire of jealousy. On seeing Agnelette again, so fresh and pretty, so innocently happy, and worse still, seeing her at the moment when she was about to be married to another, Thibault, who had not given a thought to her for the last 3 months, Thibault, who had never had any intention of keeping the promise which she made her, Thibault now brought himself to believe that he had never ceased to love her. He persuaded himself that Agnelette was engaged to him by oath, that Engoulevent was carrying off what belonged to him, and he almost leaped from his hiding place to rush after her and reproach her with her infidelity. Agnelette, now no longer his, at once appeared to his eyes as endowed with all the virtues and good qualities, all in short that would make it advantageous to marry her, which, when he had only to speak the word and everything would have been his, he had not even suspected. After being the victim of so much deception, to lose what he looked upon as his own particular treasure, to which he had imagined that it would not be too late to return at any time, simply because he never dreamed that anyone would wish to take it from him, seemed to him the last stroke of ill fortune. His despair was no less profound and gloomy, that it was a mute despair. He bit his fists, he knocked his head against the sides of the tree, and finally began to cry and sob. But they were not those tears and sobs which gradually soften the heart, and are often kindly agents in dispersing a bad humor and reviving a better one. No, they were tears and sobs arising rather from anger than from regret, and these tears and sobs had no power to drive the hatred out of Thibault's heart. As some of his tears fell visibly down his face, so it seemed that others fell on his heart within like drops of gall. He declared that he loved Agnelette, he lamented at having lost her. Nevertheless, this furious man, with all his tender love, would gladly have been able to see her fall dead, together with her bridegroom, at the foot of the altar when the priest was about to join them. But happily God, who was reserving the two children for other trials, did not allow this fatal wish to formulate itself in Thibault's mind. They were like those who, surrounded by storm, hear the noise of the thunder and see the forked flashes of lightning, and yet remain untouched by the deadly fluid. Before long, the shoemaker began to feel ashamed of his tears and sobs. He forced back the former and made an effort to swallow the latter. He came out of his lair, not quite knowing where he was, and rushed off in the direction of his hut, covering a league in a quarter of an hour. This mad race, however, by causing him to perspire, somewhat calmed him down. At last he recognized the surroundings of his home. He went into his hut as a tiger might enter its den, closed the door behind him, and went and crouched down in the darkest corner he could find in the miserable lodging. There, his elbows on his knees, his chin on his hands, he sat and thought. And what thoughts were they which occupied this unhappy, desperate man? Ask of Milton what were Satan's thoughts after his fall. He went over again all the old questions which had upset his mind from the beginning, which had brought despair upon so many before him, and would bring despair to so many that came after him. Why should some be born in bondage and others be born to power? Why should there be so much inequality with regard to a thing which takes place in exactly the same way in all classes, namely birth? By what means can this game of natures, in which chance forever holds the cards against mankind, be made a fairer one? And is not the only way to accomplish this to do what the clever gamester does, get the devil to back him up? He had certainly thought so once. To cheat? He had tried that game himself, and what had he gained by it? Each time he had held a good hand, each time he had felt sure of the game, it was the devil after all who had won. What benefit had he reaped from this deadly power that had been given to him of working evil to others? None. Agnelette had been taken from him, the owner of the mill had driven him away, the bailiff's wife had made game of him, his first wish had caused the death of poor Marcotte, and had not even procured him a haunch of the buck that he had been so ambitious to obtain, and this had been the starting point of all his disappointed longings, for he had been obliged to give the buck to the dogs so as to put them off the scent of the black wolf. And then this rapid multiplication of devil's hairs was appalling. He recalled the tale of the philosopher who asked for a grain of wheat, multiplied by each of the 64 squares of the chessboard. The abundant harvests of 1,000 years were required to fill the last square, and he, how many wishes yet remained to him? 7 or 8 at the outside? The unhappy man dared not look at himself, either in the spring which lurked at the foot of one of the trees in the forest, or in the mirror that hung against the wall. He feared to render an exact account of himself, of the time still left to him in which to exercise his power. He preferred to remain in the night of uncertainty than to face that terrible dawn which must rise when the night was over. But still there must be a way of continuing matters, so that the misfortunes of others should bring him good of some kind. He thought surely that if he had received a scientific education, instead of being a poor shoemaker, scarcely knowing how to read or cipher, he would have found out by the aid of science some combinations which would infallibly have procured for him both riches and happiness. Poor fool! If he had been a man of learning, he would have known the legend of Dr. Faust. To what did the omnipotence conferred on him by Mephistopheles lead Faust, the dreamer, the thinker, the preeminent scholar? To the murder of Valentine, to Margaret's suicide, to the pursuit of Helen of Troy, the pursuit of an empty shadow. And moreover, how could Thibault think coherently at all of ways and means, while jealousy was raging in his heart, while he continued to picture Agnelette at the altar giving herself for life to another than himself? And who was that other? That wretched little Engoulevent, the man who had spied him out when he was perched in the tree, who had found his boar spear in the bush, which had been the cause of the stripes he had received from Marcotte. Ah! If he had but known to him and not to Marcotte, would he have willed that evil should befall? What was the physical torture he had undergone from the blows of the strap compared to the moral torture he was enduring now? And if only ambition had not taken such hold upon him, had not borne him on the wings of pride above his sphere, what happiness might have been his as the clever workman, able to earn as much as 6 francs a day with Agnelette for his charming little housekeeper. For he had certainly been the one whom Agnelette had first loved. Perhaps, although marrying another man, she still loved him. And as Thibault sat pondering over these things, he became conscious that time was passing, that night was approaching. However modest might be the fortune of the wedded pair, however limited the desires of the peasants who had followed them, it was quite certain that bride, bridegroom, and peasants were all at this hour feasting merrily together. And he was sad and alone. There was no one to prepare a meal for him, and what was there in his house to eat or drink? A little bread, a little water, and solitude, in place of that blessing from heaven which we call a sister, a mistress, a wife. But after all, why should not he also dine merrily and abundantly? Could he not go and dine wheresoever he liked? Had he not money in his pocket from the last game he had sold to the host of the Boule d'Or? And could he not spend on himself as much as the wedded couple and all their guests together? He had only himself to please. "And by my faith," he exclaimed, "I am an idiot indeed to stay here, with my brain racked by jealousy and my stomach with hunger, when, with the aid of a good dinner and 2 or 3 bottles of wine, I can rid myself of both torments before another hour is over. I will be off to get food, and better still, to get drink." In order to carry this determination into effect, Thibault took the road to Fertimillon, where there was an excellent restaurant known as the Dauphin d'Or, able, it was said, to serve dinners equal to those provided by his head cook for his Highness, the Duke of Orleans. End of chapter 14. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 15 of The Wolf Leader by Alexandre Dumas, translated by Alfred Allinson, 1852 to 1929. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 15. The Lord of Vauparfond. Thibault, on arriving at the Dauphin d'Or, ordered himself as fine a dinner as he could think of. It would have been quite easy for him to have engaged a private room, but he would not then have enjoyed the personal sense of superiority. He wished the company of ordinary diners to see him eat his poulet and his eel in its delicate sauce. He wished the other drinkers to envy him his 3 different wines, drunk out of 3 different shaped glasses. He wished everybody to hear him give his orders in a haughty voice, to hear the ring of his money. As he gave his first order, a man in a grey coat, seated in the darkest corner of the room with a half bottle of wine before him, turned round as if recognizing a voice he knew. And as it turned out, this was one of Thibault's acquaintances. It is scarcely necessary to add, a tavern acquaintance. Thibault, since he had given up making shoes by day and instead had his wolves about at night, had made many such acquaintances. On seeing that it was Thibault, the other man turned his face away quickly, but not so quickly but that Thibault had time to recognize Auguste François Levasseur, valet to Raoul, the Lord of Vauparfond. "Holloa, François!" Thibault called out. "What are you doing, sitting there in the corner and sulking like a monk in Lent, instead of taking your dinner openly and cheerfully, as I am doing, in full view of everybody?" François made no reply to this interrogation, but signed to Thibault to hold his tongue. "I am not to speak, not to speak," said Thibault, "and supposing it does not suit me to hold my tongue, supposing I wish to talk, and that I am bored at having to dine alone, and that it pleases me to say, 'Friend François, come here, I invite you to dine with me.' You will not? No? Very well, then I shall come and fetch you." And Thibault rose from his seat, and followed by all eyes, went up to his friend and gave him a slap on the shoulder, vigorous enough to dislocate it. "Pretend that you have made a mistake, Thibault, or you will lose me my place. Do you not see that I am not in livery, but am only wearing my drab greatcoat? I am here as proxy in a love affair from my master, and I am waiting for a letter from a lady to carry back to him." "That's another matter altogether, and I understand now, and am sorry for my indiscretion. I should like, however, to have dined in your company." "Well, nothing is easier. Order your dinner to be served in a separate room, and I will give word to our host
that if another man, dressed in gray, like me, comes in, he is to show him upstairs. He and I are old cronies, and understand one another." "Good," said Thibault. And he therewith ordered his dinner to be taken up to a room on the first floor, which looked out upon the street. François seated himself so as to be able to see the person he was expecting, while some distance off, as he came down the hill of Fert-Millon. The dinner which Thibault had ordered was quite sufficient for the two. All that he did was to send for another bottle of wine or so. Thibault had only taken 2 lessons from Maître Magloire, but he had been an apt pupil, and they had done their work. Moreover, Thibault had something which he wished to forget, and he counted on the wine to accomplish this for him. It was good fortune, he felt, to have met a friend with whom he could talk, for in the state of mind and heart in which he was, talking was as good a help towards oblivion as drinking. Accordingly, he was no sooner seated and the door shut, and his hat stuck well down onto his head, so that François might not notice the change in the color of his hair, than he burst at once into conversation, boldly taking the bull by the horns. "And now, friend François," he said, "you are going to explain to me some of your words which I did not quite understand." "I am not surprised at that," replied François, leaning back in his chair with an air of conceited impertinence. "We attendants on fashionable lords learn to speak court language, which everyone, of course, does not understand." "Perhaps not, but if you explain it to your friends they may possibly understand." "Quite so. Ask what you like, and I will answer." "I look to your doing so the more that I will undertake to supply you with what will help to loosen your tongue. First, let me ask, why do you call yourself a greycoat? I thought greycoat another name for a jackass." "Jackass yourself, friend Thibault," said François, laughing at the shoemaker's ignorance. "No, a greycoat is a liveried servant who puts on a gray overall to hide his livery, while he stands sentinel behind a pillar or mounts guard inside a doorway." "So you mean that at this moment, then, my good François, you are on sentry? Go. And who is coming to relieve you?" "Champagne, who is in the Comtesse de Montgobert's service." I see. I understand exactly. Your master, the Lord of Vauparfond, is in love with the Comtesse de Montgobert, and you are now awaiting a letter which Champagne is to bring from the lady. Optime, as the tutor to Monsieur Raoul's young brother says." "My Lord Raoul is a lucky fellow." "Yes, indeed," said François, drawing himself up. "And what a beautiful creature the Countess is!" "You know her, then?" "I have seen her out hunting with His Highness the Duke of Orléans and Madame de Montesson." Thibault, in speaking, had said "out hunting." "My friend, let me tell you that in society we do not say hunting and shooting, but huntin' and shootin'." "Oh," said Thibault, "I am not so particular to a letter as all that. To the health of my Lord Raoul." As François put down his glass on the table, he uttered an exclamation. He had that moment caught sight of Champagne. They threw open the window and called to this third comer, and Champagne, with all the ready intuition of the well-bred servant, understood at once and went upstairs. He was dressed like François in a long gray coat, and had brought a letter with him. "Well?" asked François, as he caught sight of the letter in his hand. "And is there to be a meeting tonight?" "Yes," answered Champagne, with evident delight. "That's all right," said François cheerfully. Thibault was surprised at these expressions of apparent sympathy on the part of the servants with their master's happiness. "Is it your master's good luck that you are so pleased about?" he asked of François. "Oh, dear me, no," replied the latter, "but when my master is engaged, I am at liberty." "And do you make use of your liberty?" "One may be a valet, and yet have one's own share of good luck, and also know how to spend the time more or less profitably," answered François, bridling as he spoke. "And you, Champagne?" "Oh, I," replied the last comer, holding his wine up to the light. "Yes, I too hope to make good use of it." "Well, then, here's to all your love affairs, since everybody seems to have one or more on hand," said Thibault. "The same to yours," replied the 2 other men in chorus. "As to myself," said the shoemaker, a look of hatred to his fellow creatures passing over his face, "I am the only person who loves nobody, and whom nobody loves." His companion looked at him with a certain surprised curiosity. "Ah, ha! said François. "Is the report that is whispered abroad about you in the countryside a true tale, then?" "Report it to me." "Yes, about you," put in Champagne. "Oh, then they say the same thing about me at Montgobert as they do at Vauparfond?" Champagne nodded his head. "Well, and what is it they do say?" "That you are a werewolf," said François. Thibault laughed aloud. "Tell me now, have I a tail?" he said. "Have I a wolf's claws? Have I a wolf's snout?" "We only repeat what other people say," rejoined Champagne. "We do not say that it is so." "Well, anyhow, you must acknowledge," said Thibault, "that werewolves have excellent wine." "By my faith, yes!" exclaimed both the valets. "To the health of the devil who provides it, gentlemen." The two men, who were holding their glasses in their hand, put both glasses down on the table. "What is that for?" asked Thibault. "You must find someone else to drink that health with you," said François. "I won't, that's flat." "Nor I," added Champagne. "Well, and good then, I will drink all 3 glasses myself," and he immediately proceeded to do so. "Friend Thibault," said the Baron's valet, "it is time we separated." "So soon?" said Thibault. "My master is awaiting me, and no doubt with some impatience. The letter from Champagne? Here it is." "Let us take farewell, then, of your friend Thibault, and be off to our business and our pleasures, and leave him to his pleasures and business." And so saying, François winked at his friend, who responded with a similar sign of understanding between them. "We must not separate," said Thibault, "without drinking a stirrup cup together." "But not in those glasses," said François, pointing to the 3 from which Thibault had drunk to the enemy of mankind. "You are very particular, gentlemen. Better call the sacristan and have them washed in holy water." "Not quite that, but rather than refuse the polite invitation of a friend, we will call for the water and have fresh glasses brought." "These 3, then," said Thibault, who was beginning to feel the effects of the wine he had drunk, "are fit for nothing more than to be thrown out of the window. To the devil with you!" he exclaimed, as he took up one of them and sent it flying. As the glass went through the air, it left a track of light behind it, which blazed and went out like a flash of lightning. Thibault took up the 2 remaining glasses and threw them in turn, and each time the same thing happened. But the 3rd flash was followed by a loud peal of thunder. Thibault shut the window, and was thinking, as he turned to his seat again, how he should explain this strange occurrence to his companions, but his 2 companions had disappeared. "Cowards!" he muttered. Then he looked for a glass, but found none left. "That's awkward," he said. "I must drink out of the bottle, that's all." And suiting the action to the word, Thibault finished up his dinner by draining the bottle, which did not help to steady his brain, already somewhat shaky. At 9 o'clock, Thibault called the innkeeper, paid his account, and departed. He was in an angry disposition of enmity against all the world. The thoughts from which he had hoped to escape possessed him more and more. Agnelette was being taken farther and farther from him as the time went by. Everyone, wife or mistress, had someone to love them. This day, which had been one of hatred and despair to him, had been one full of the promise of joy and happiness for everybody else. The Lord of Vauparfond, the 2 wretched valets, François and Champagne, each of them had a bright star of hope to follow, while he alone went stumbling along in the darkness. Decidedly, there was a curse upon him. "But," he went on thinking to himself, "if so, the pleasures of the damned belong to me, and I have a right to claim them." As these thoughts went surging through his brain, as he walked along cursing aloud, shaking his fist at the sky, he was on the way to his hut, and had nearly reached it, when he heard a horse coming up behind him at a gallop. "Ah," said Thibault, "here comes the Lord of Vauparfond, hastening to the meeting with his love. I should laugh, my fine Sir Raoul, if my Lord of Montgobert managed just to catch you. You would not get off quite so easily as if it were Maître Magloire. There would be swords out, and blows given and received." Thus engaged in thinking what would happen if the Comte de Montgobert were to surprise his rival, Thibault, who was walking in the road, evidently did not get out of the way quickly enough, for the horseman, seeing a peasant of some kind barring his passage, brought his whip down upon him in a violent blow, calling out at the same time, "Get out of the way, you beggar, if you don't wish to be trampled under the horse's feet." Thibault, still half drunk, was conscious of a crowd of mingled sensations, of the lashing of the whip, the collision with the horse, and the rolling through cold water and mud while the horseman passed on. He rose to his knees, furious with anger, and shaking his fist at the retreating figure. "Would the devil," he exclaimed, "I might just for once have my turn at being one of you great lords! Might just for 24 hours take your place, Monsieur Raoul de Vauparfond, instead of being only Thibault the shoemaker, so that I might know what it was to have a fine horse to ride on instead of tramping on foot, might be able to whip the peasants I met on the road, and have the opportunity of paying court to these beautiful women, who deceive their husbands as the Comtesse de Montgobert does." The words were hardly out of his mouth when the Baron's horse shied, throwing the rider over its head. End of chapter 15. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 16 of The Wolf Leader by Alexandre Dumas, translated by Alfred Allinson, 1852–1929. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 16. My Lady's Lady. Thibault was delighted at seeing what had happened to the young Baron, whose hand, anything but light, had so shortly before made use of his whip on Thibault's shoulders, which still smarted with the blow. The latter now ran at full speed to see how far Monsieur Raoul de Vauparfond was injured. He found a body lying insensible, stretched across the road, with the horse standing and snorting beside it. But Thibault could hardly believe his senses on perceiving that the figure lying in the road was not the same as had, but 5 minutes previously, ridden past him and given him the lash with the whip. In the first place, his figure was not in the dress of a gentleman, but clothed like a peasant, and what was more, the clothes he had on seemed to Thibault to be the same as he himself had been wearing only a moment before. His surprise increased more and more, and amounted almost to stupefaction on further recognizing in the inert, unconscious figure not only his own clothes, but his own face. His astonishment naturally led him to turn his eyes from this second Thibault to his own person, when he became aware that an equally remarkable change had come over his costume. Instead of shoes and gaiters, his legs were now encased in an elegant pair of hunting boots, reaching to the knee, as soft and smooth as a pair of silk stockings, with a roll over the instep, and finished off with a pair of fine silver spurs. The knee breeches were no longer of corduroy, but of the most beautiful buckskin, fastened with little gold buckles. His long, coarse, olive-colored coat was replaced by a handsome green hunting coat, with gold lace facings thrown open to display a waistcoat of fine white jean, while over the artistically pleated shirt hung the soft wavy folds of a cambric cravat. Not a single article of dress about him but had been transformed, even to his old lantern-shaped hat, which was now a three-cornered one, trimmed with gold lace to match the coat. The stick also, such as workmen carry, partly for walking and partly for self-defense, and which he had been holding in his hand a minute before, had now given place to a light whip, with which he gave a cut through the air, listening with a sense of aristocratic pleasure to the whistling sound it made. And finally, his slender figure was drawn in at the waist by a belt, from which hung a hunting knife, half sword, half dagger. Thibault was pleased beyond measure at finding himself clothed in such a delightful costume, and with a feeling of vanity, natural under the circumstances, he was overcome with the desire to ascertain without delay how the dress suited his face. But where could he go to look at himself out there in the midst of pitch darkness? Then, looking about him, he saw that he was only a stone's throw from his own hut. "Ah, to be sure," he said, "nothing easier, for I have my glass there." And he made haste towards his hut, intending, like Narcissus, to enjoy his own beauty in peace, and all to himself. But the door of the hut was locked, and Thibault felt vainly for the key. All he could find in his pockets was a well-fitted purse, a sweetmeat box containing scented lozenges, and a little mother-of-pearl and gold penknife. What could he have done then with his door key? Then suddenly a bright thought occurred to him. Possibly the key was in the pocket of that other Thibault, who was lying out there in the road. He went back and felt in the breeches pocket, where he discovered the key at once, in company with a few sous. Holding the rough, clumsy thing in the tips of his fingers, he returned to open the door. The inside of the hut was even darker than the night outside, and Thibault groped about to find the steel, the tinder and flint, and the matches, and then proceeded to try and light the candle, which consisted of an end stuck into an empty bottle. In a second or two this was accomplished, but in the course of the operation Thibault was obliged to take hold of the candle with his fingers. "Pah!" he said, "what pigs these peasants are! I wonder how they can live in this dirty sort of way." However, the candle was alight, which was the chief matter, and Thibault now took down his mirror, and bringing it to the light, looked at himself in it. His eye had scarcely caught sight of the reflected image than he uttered a cry of astonishment. It was no longer himself that he saw, or rather, although it was still Thibault in spirit, it was no longer Thibault in body. His spirit had entered into the body of a handsome young man of 25 or 26 years of age, with blue eyes, pink fresh cheeks, red lips, and white teeth. In short, it had entered into the body of the Baron Raoul de Vauparfond. Then Thibault recalled the wish that he had uttered in the moment of his anger after the blow from the whip and his collision with the horse. His wish had been that for 24 hours he might be the Baron de Vauparfond, and the Baron de Vauparfond be Thibault, which now explained to him what had at first seemed inexplicable, why the unconscious man now lying in the road was dressed in his clothes and had his face. "But I must not forget one thing," he said, "that is that although I seem to be here, I am not really here, but lying out there, so I must be careful to see that during the 24 hours, during which I shall be imprudent enough to be away from myself, no irreparable harm comes to me. Come now, Monsieur de Vauparfond, do not be so fastidious. Carry the poor man in and lay him gently on his bed there." And although, with his aristocratic instincts, Monsieur de Vauparfond found the task very repugnant to him, Thibault nevertheless courageously took up his own body in his arms and carried himself from the road to the bed. Having thus placed the body in safety, he blew out the light for fear that any harm should come to his other self before he came to. Then, carefully locking the door, he hid the key in the hollow of a tree, where he was in the habit of leaving it when not wishing to take it with him. The next thing to do was to get hold of the horse's bridle and mount into the saddle. Once there, Thibault had a preliminary moment of some uneasiness, for, having travelled more on foot than on horseback, he was not an accomplished rider, and he naturally feared that he might not be able to keep his seat when the horse began to move. But it seemed that while inheriting Raoul's body, he also inherited his physical qualities, for the horse being an intelligent beast, and perfectly conscious of the momentary want of assurance on the part of his rider, made an effort to throw him, whereupon Thibault instinctively gathered up the reins, pressed his knees against the horse's sides, dug his spurs into them, and gave the animal 2 or 3 cuts of the whip, which brought it to order on the spot. Thibault, perfectly unknown to himself, was a past master in horsemanship. This little affair with the horse enabled Thibault more fully to realize his duality. As far as the body was concerned, he was the Baron Raoul de Vauparfond, from top to toe, but as far as the spirit was concerned, he was still Thibault. It was therefore certain that the spirit of the young lord who had lent him his body was now sleeping in the form of the unconscious Thibault which he had left behind in the hut. The division of substance and spirit between himself and the Baron, however, left him with a very vague idea of what he was going, or would have to do. That he was going to Mont Gobert in answer to the Countess's letter, so much he knew, but what was in the letter? At what hour was he expected? How was he to gain admission to the castle? Not one of these questions could he answer, and it only remained for him to discover what to do step by step as he proceeded. Suddenly it flashed across him that probably the Countess's letter was somewhere on his person. He felt about his dress, and sure enough, inside the side pocket of his coat was something, which by its shape seemed to be the article he wanted. He stopped his horse, and putting his hand into his pocket, drew out a little scented leather case lined with white satin. In one side of the case were several letters, in the other only one. No doubt the latter would tell him what he wanted to know if he could once get to read it. He was now only a short distance from the village of Fleury, and he galloped on hoping that he might find a house still lighted up. But villagers go to bed early in those days, even earlier than they do now, and Thibault went from one end of the street to the other without seeing a single light. At last, thinking he heard some kind of movement in the stables of an inn, he called. A stable boy sallied out with a lantern, and Thibault, forgetting for the moment that he was a lord, said, "Friend, could you show me a light for a moment? You would be doing me a service." "And that's what you go and call a chap out of bed for?" answered the stable boy rudely. "Well, you're a nice sort of young 'un, you are." and turning his back on Thibault, he was just going to re-enter the stable when Thibault perceived that he had gone on a wrong tack, now raised his voice, calling out, "Look here, sirrah, bring your lantern here and give me a light, or I'll lay my whip across your back." "Ah, pardon, my lord," said the stable boy, "I did not see who it was I was speaking to," and he immediately stood on tiptoe, holding the lantern up as Thibault directed him. Thibault unfolded the letter and read, "My dear Raoul, the goddess Venus has certainly taken us under her protection. A grand hunt of some kind is to take place tomorrow out in the direction of Tury. I know no particulars about it. All I do know is that he is going away this evening. You therefore start at 9 o'clock, so as to be here at 10:30. Come in by the way you know. Someone whom you know will be awaiting you, and will bring you know where. Last time you came, I don't mean to upbraid you, but it did seem to me you stayed a long time in the corridors. Jane." "Devil take it," murmured Thibault. "I beg your pardon, my lord," said the stable boy. "Nothing, you lout, except that I do not require you any longer, and you can go." "A good journey to you, my lord," said the stable boy, bowing to the ground, and he went back to his stable. "Devil take it," repeated Thibault, "the letter gives me precious little information, except that we are under the protection of the goddess Venus, and that he goes away this evening, that the Comtesse de Montgobert expects me at 10:30, and that her Christian name is Jane. As for the rest, I am to go in by the way I know. I shall be awaited by someone I know, and taken where I know." Thibault scratched his ear, which is what everybody does in every country in the world when plunged into awkward circumstances. He longed to go and wake up the Lord of Vauparfond's spirit, which was just now sleeping in Thibault's body on Thibault's bed. But apart from the loss of time which this would involve, it might also cause considerable inconvenience, for the Baron's spirit, on seeing its own body so near to it, might be taken with the desire of re-entering it. This would give rise to a struggle in which Thibault could not well defend himself without doing serious harm to his own person. Some other way out of the difficulty must therefore be found. He had heard a great deal about the wonderful sagacity of animals, and had himself during his life in the country had occasion more than once to admire their instinct, and he now determined to trust to that of his horse. Riding back into the main road, he turned the horse in the direction of Montgobert and let it have its head. The horse immediately started off at a gallop. It had evidently understood. Thibault troubled himself no further. It was now the horse's affair to bring him safely to his destination. On reaching the corner of the park wall, the animal stopped, not apparently because it was in doubt as to which road to take, but something seemed to make it uneasy, and it pricked its ears. At the same time, Thibault also fancied that he caught sight of two shadows, but they must have been only shadows, for although he stood up in his stirrups and looked all around him, he could see absolutely nothing. They were probably poachers, he thought, who had reasons like himself for wishing to get inside the park. There being no longer anything to bar his passage, he had only, as before, to let the horse go its own way, and he accordingly did so. The horse followed the walls of the park at a quick trot, carefully choosing the soft edge of the road and not uttering a single neigh. The intelligent animal seemed as if it knew that it must make no sound, or at least as little sound as possible. In this way they went along the whole of one side of the park, and on reaching the corner, the horse turned as the wall turned, and stopped before a small breach in the same. "It's through here, evidently," said Thibault, "that we have to go." The horse answered by sniffing at the breach and scraping the ground with its foot. Thibault gave the animal the rein, and it managed to climb up and through the breach, over the loose stones which rolled away beneath its hoof. Horse and rider were now within the park. One of the three difficulties had been successfully overcome. Thibault had got in by the way he knew. It now remained to find the person whom he knew, and he thought it wisest to leave this also to his horse. The horse went on for another 5 minutes, and then stopped at a short distance from the castle, before the door of one of those little huts of rough logs and bark and clay which are built up in parks as painters introduce buildings into their landscapes solely for the sake of ornament. On hearing the horse's hoofs, someone partly opened the door, and the horse stopped in front of it. A pretty girl came out and asked in a low voice, "Is it you, Monsieur Raoul?" "Yes, my child, it is I," answered Thibault, dismounting. "Madame was terribly afraid that drunken fool of a Champagne might not have given you the letter." "She need not have been afraid. Champagne brought it me with the most exemplary punctuality." Leave your horse, then, and come." "But who will look after it?" "Why, Cramoisi, of course, the man who always does." "Ah, yes, to be sure," said Thibault, as if these details were familiar to him. "Cramoisi will look after it." "Come, come," said the maid, "we must make haste, or Madame will complain again that we loiter in the corridors." And as she spoke these words, which recalled a phrase in the letter which had been written to Raoul, she laughed and showed a row of pearly white teeth, and Thibault felt that he should like to loiter in the park before waiting to get into the corridors. Then the maid suddenly stood still a moment with her head bent, listening. "What is it?" asked Thibault. "I thought I heard the sound of a branch creaking under somebody's foot." "Very likely," said Thibault, "no doubt Cramoisi's foot." "All the more reason that you should be careful what you do, at all events out here." "I don't understand." "Do you not know that Cramoisi is the man I am engaged to?" "Ah, to be sure, but when I am alone with you, my dear Rose, I always forget that." "I am called Rose now, am I? I never knew such a forgetful man as you, Monsieur Raoul." "I call you Rose, my pretty one, because the rose is the queen of flowers, and you are the queen of waiting maids." "In good truth, my lord," said the maid, "I have always found you a lively, witty gentleman, but you surpassed yourself this evening." Thibault drew himself up, flattered by this remark. Really a letter addressed to the Baron, but which it had fallen to the shoemaker to unseal. "Let us hope your mistress will think the same," he said. "As to that," said the waiting maid, "any man can make one of these ladies of fashion think him the cleverest and wittiest in the world simply by holding his tongue." "Thank you," he said, "I will remember what you say." "Hush!" said the woman to Thibault, "there is Madame behind the dressing-room curtains. Follow me now, steadily." For they had now to cross an open space that lay between the wooded part of the park and the flight of steps leading up to the castle. Thibault began walking towards the ladder. "Now, now," said the maid, catching hold of him by the arm, "what are you doing, you foolish man?" "What am I doing? Well, I confess, Suzette, I don't know in the least what I am doing." "Suzette? So that's my name now, is it? I think Monsieur does me the honor of calling me in turn by the name of all his mistresses. But come this way. You are not dreaming, I suppose, of going through the great reception rooms? That would give a fine opportunity to my lord the Count, truly." And the maid hurried Thibault towards a little door, to the right of which was a spiral staircase. Halfway up, Thibault put his arm round his companion's waist, which was as slender and supple as a snake. "I think we must be in the corridors now, eh?" he asked, trying to kiss the young woman's pretty cheek. "No, not yet," she answered, "but never mind that." "By my faith," he said, "if my name this evening were Thibault instead of Raoul, I would carry you up with me to the garrets, instead of stopping on the first floor." At that moment a door was heard grating on its hinges. "Quick, quick, monsieur," said the maid, "Madame is growing impatient." And drawing Thibault after her, she ran up the remaining stairs to the corridor, opened a door, pushed Thibault into a room, and shut the door after him, firmly believing that it was the Baron Raoul de Vauparfond, or as she herself called him, the most forgetful man in the world, whom she had thus secured. End of Chapter 16. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 17 of The Wolf Leader by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by Alfred Allinson, 1852–1929. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 17. The Baron de Montgobert. Thibault found himself in the Countess's room. If the magnificence of Bailiff Magloire's furniture, rescued from the lumber room of His Highness the Duke of Orleans, had astonished Thibault, the daintiness, the harmony, the taste of the Countess's room filled him with intoxicating delight. The rough child of the forest had never seen anything like it, even in dreams, for one cannot even dream of things of which we have no idea. Double curtains were drawn across the two windows, the one set of white silk trimmed with lace, the other of pale china blue satin embroidered with silver flowers. The bed and the toilet table were draped to match the windows, and were nearly smothered in clouds of Valenciennes lace. The walls were hung with very light rose-colored silk, over which thick folds of Indian muslin delicate as woven air, undulated like waves of mist at the slightest breath of air from the door. The ceiling was composed of a medallion painted by Boucher, and representing the toilet of Venus. She was handing her cupids the various articles of a woman's apparel, and these were now all distributed with the exception of the goddess's girdle. The central medallion was surrounded by a series of panels, on which were painted supposed views of Cnidos, Paphos, and Amathus. All the furniture, chairs, armchairs, settees, sociables, was covered with china satin similar to that of the curtains. Over the groundwork of the carpet, of the color of pale green water, were scattered bouquets of blue cornflowers, pink poppies, and white daisies. The tables were of rosewood, the corner pieces of Indian lacquer, and the whole room was softly lighted by pink wax candles held in 2 candelabra. A vague and indescribably delicate perfume pervaded the air, one could not say from what sweet essence, for it was scarcely even a perfume, but rather an emanation, the same kind of odorous exhalation whereby Aeneas in the Aeneid recognized the presence of his mother. Thibault, pushed into the room by the waiting maid, made one step forward and then stopped. He had taken everything in at a glance, and hailed everything at a breath. For a second there passed before his mind's eye like a vision, Agnelette's little cottage, Madame Paulet's dining room, the bedchamber of the bailiff's wife. But they disappeared as quickly to give place to this delicious paradise of love into which he had been transported as by magic. He could scarcely believe that what he looked upon was real. Were there really men and women in the world so blessed by fortune as to live in such surroundings as these? Had he not been carried to some wizard's castle, to some fairy's palace? And those who enjoyed such favor as this, what special good had they done? What special evil had they done, who were deprived of these advantages? Why, instead of wishing to be the Baron for 24 hours, had he not wished to be the Countess's lapdog all his life? How would he bear to be Thibault again, after having seen all this? He had just reached this point in his reflections when the dressing-room door opened, and the Countess herself appeared, a fit bird for such a nest, a fit flower for such a sweet-scented garden. Her hair, fastened only by 4 diamond pins, hung down loosely to one side, while the rest was gathered into one large curl that hung over the shoulder and fell into her bosom. The graceful lines of her lithe and well-formed figure, no longer hidden by puffings of dress, were clearly indicated beneath her loose pink silk gown, richly covered with lace. So fine and transparent was the silk of her stockings, that it was more like pearl-white flesh than any texture, and her tiny feet were shod in little slippers made of cloth of silver, with red heels. But not an atom of jewelry, no bracelets on the arms, no rings on the fingers, just one row of pearls round the throat, that was all. But what pearls! Worth a king's ransom! As this radiant apparition came towards him, Thibault fell on his knees. He bowed himself, feeling crushed at the sight of this luxury, of this beauty, which to him seemed inseparable. "Yes, yes, you may well kneel. Kneel lower, lower yet. Kiss my feet, kiss the carpet, kiss the floor. But I shall not any the more forgive you. You are a monster." "In truth, madame, if I compare myself with you, I am even worse than that." "Ah, yes, pretend that you mistake my words, and think I am only speaking of your outward appearance, when you know I am speaking of your behavior, and indeed, if your perfidious soul were imaged in your face, you would verily and indeed be a monster of ugliness. But yet it is not so, for Monsieur, for all his wickedness and infamous doings, still remains the handsomest gentleman in all the country road. But come now, Monsieur, ought you not to be ashamed of yourself?" "Because I am the handsomest gentleman in the neighborhood?" asked Thibault, detecting by the tone of the lady's voice that his crime was not an irremediable one. "No, Monsieur, but for having the blackest soul and the falsest heart ever hidden beneath such a gay and golden exterior. Now, get up, and come and give an account of yourself to me." And the Countess, so speaking, held out a hand to Thibault, which offered pardon at the same time that it demanded a kiss. Thibault took the soft, sweet hand in his own and kissed it. Never had his lips touched anything so like satin. The Countess now seated herself on the settee, and made a sign to Raoul to sit down beside her. "Let me know something of your doings since you were last here," said the Countess to him. "First, tell me, dear Countess," replied Thibault, "when I last was here." "Do you mean you have forgotten?" One does not generally acknowledge things of that kind unless seeking for a cause of quarrel." "On the contrary, dear friend, it is because the recollection of that last visit is so present with me that I think it must have been only yesterday we were together, and I try in vain to recall what I have done, and I assure you I have committed no other crime since yesterday but that of loving you." "That's not a bad speech, but you will not get yourself out of disgrace by paying compliments." "Dear Countess," said Thibault, "supposing we put off explanations to another time." "No, you must answer me now. It is 5 days since I last saw you. What have you been doing all that time?" "I am waiting for you to tell me, Countess. How can you expect me, conscious as I am of my innocence, to accuse myself?" "Very well, then. I will not begin by saying anything about your loitering in the corridors." "Oh, pray let us speak of it. How can you think, Countess, that knowing you, the diamond of diamonds, was waiting for me, I should stop to pick up an imitation pearl?" "Ah, but I know how fickle men are, and Lisette is such a pretty girl." "Not so, dear Jane, but you must understand that she being our confidante, and knowing all our secrets, I cannot treat her quite like a servant." "How agreeable it must be to able to say to oneself, I am deceiving the Comtesse de Montgobert, and I am the rival of Monsieur Cramoisi." "Very well, then, there shall be no more loiterings in the corridors, no more kisses for poor Lisette, supposing, of course, there ever have been any." "Well, after all, there is no great harm in that." "Do you mean that I have done something even worse?" "Where had you been the other night when you were met on the road between Erneville and Villers-Cotterets?" "Someone met me on the road?" "Yes, on the Erneville road. Where were you coming from?" "I was coming home from fishing." "Fishing? What, fishing?" "They had been drawing the Berval ponds." "Oh, we know all about that. You are such a fine fisher, are you not, monsieur? And what sort of an eel were you bringing back in your net, returning from your fishing at 2 o'clock in the morning?" "I had been dining with my friend the Baron at Vez." "At Vez? Ha! I fancy you went there mainly to console the beautiful recluse, whom the jealous Baron keeps shut up there a regular prisoner, so they say. But even that I can forgive you." "What, is there a blacker crime still?" said Thibault, who was beginning to feel quite reassured, seeing how quickly the pardon followed on the accusation, however serious it appeared at first. "Yes, at the ball given by His Highness the Duke of Orléans." "What ball?" "Why, the one yesterday. It's not so very long ago, is it?" Oh, yesterday's ball. I was admiring you." "Indeed, but I was not there." "Is it necessary for you to be present, Jane, for me to admire you? Cannot one admire you in remembrance as truly as in person? And if, when absent, you triumph by comparison, the victory is only so much the greater." "I dare say, and it was in order to carry out the comparison to its utmost limits that you danced 4 times with Madame de Bonneuil. They are very pretty, are they not, those dark women who cover themselves with rouge, and have eyebrows like the Chinese mannequins on my screens, and mustaches like a grenadier?" "Do you know what we talked about during those 4 dances?" "It is true, then, that you danced 4 times with her?" "It is true, no doubt, since you say so." "Is that a proper sort of answer?" "What other could I give? Could anyone contradict what was said by so pretty a mouth? Not I, certainly, who would still bless it, even though it were pronouncing my sentence of death." And as if to await this sentence, Thibault fell on his knees before the Countess. But at that moment the door opened, and Lisette rushed in, full of alarm. "Ah, monsieur," she cried, "save yourself! Here comes my master, the Count." "The Count?" exclaimed the Countess. "Yes, the Count in person, and his huntsman, Lestocq, with him." "Impossible!" "I assure you, madame, Cramoisi saw them as plain as I see you. The poor fellow was quite pale with fright." "Ah, then the meet at Thury was all a pretense, a trap to catch me?" "Who can tell, madame? Alas, alas! Men are such deceiving creatures." "What is to be done?" asked the Countess. "Wait for the Count and kill him." said Thibault resolutely, furious at again seeing his good fortune escaping from him, at losing what above all things it had been his ambition to possess. "Kill him? Kill the Count? Are you mad, Raoul? No, no, you must fly, you must save yourself. Lisette, Lisette, take the Baron through my dressing room." And in spite of his resistance, Lisette, by dint of pushing him, got safely away, only just in time. Steps were heard coming up the wide main staircase. The Countess, with a last word of love to the supposed Raoul, glided quickly into her bedroom, while Thibault followed Lisette. She led him rapidly along the corridor where Cramoisi was keeping guard at the other end, then into a room, and through this into another, and finally into a smaller one which led into a little tower. Here the fugitives came again onto a staircase, corresponding with the one by which they had gone up, but when they reached the bottom they found the door locked. Lisette, with Thibault still following, went back up a few steps into a sort of office in which a window looking over the garden. This she opened. It was only a few feet from the ground, and Thibault jumped out, landing safely below. "You know where your horse is," called Lisette. "Jump on its back, and do not stop till you get to Vauparfond." Thibault would have liked to thank her for all her kindly warnings, but she was some 6 feet above him, and he had no time to lose. A stride or two brought him to the clump of trees under which stood the little building which served as stable for his horse. But was the horse still there? He heard a neigh, which reassured him. Only the neigh sounded, he thought, more like a cry of pain. Thibault went in, put out his hand, felt the horse, gathered up the reins, and leaped onto its back without touching the stirrups. Thibault, as we have already said, had suddenly become a consummate horseman. But the horse no sooner felt the weight of the rider on its back than the poor beast began to totter on its legs. Thibault dug his spurs in savagely, and the horse made a frantic effort to stand. But in another instant, uttering one of those pitiful neighs which Thibault had heard when he approached the stable, it rolled helplessly over onto its side. Thibault quickly disengaged his leg from under the animal, which, as the poor thing struggled to rise, he had no difficulty in doing, and he found himself again on his feet. Then it became clear to him that in order to prevent his escape, Monsieur le Comte de Montgobert had hamstrung his horse. Thibault uttered an oath. "If I ever meet you, Monsieur Comte de Montgobert," he said, "I swear that I will hamstring you as you have hamstrung this poor beast." Then he rushed out of the little building, and remembering the way he had come, turned in the direction of the breach in the wall, and walking quickly towards it, found it, climbed over the stones, and was again outside the park. But his further passage was barred, for there in front of him was the figure of a man, who stood waiting with a drawn sword in his hand. Thibault recognized the Comte de Montgobert. The Comte de Montgobert thought he recognized Raoul de Vauparfond. "Draw, Baron," said the Count. Further explanation was unnecessary. Thibault on his side, equally enraged at having the prey on which he had already set tooth and claw snatched away from him, was as ready to fight as the Count. He drew not his sword, but his hunting knife, and the two men crossed weapons. Thibault, who was something of an adept at quarterstaff, had no idea of fencing. What was his surprise, therefore, when he found that he knew by instinct how to handle his weapon, and could parry and thrust according to all the rules of the art. He parried the first 2 or 3 of the Count's blows with admirable skill. "Ah, I heard, I remember," muttered the Count between his clenched teeth, "that at last match you rivaled St. George's himself at the foils." Thibault had no conception who St. George's might be, but he was conscious of a strength and elasticity of wrist, thanks to which he felt he might have rivaled the devil himself. So far he had only been on the defensive, but the Count having aimed 1 or 2 unsuccessful lunges at him, he saw his opportunity, struck out, and sent his knife clean through his adversary's shoulder. The Count dropped his sword, tottered, and falling on to one knee, cried, "Help, Lestock!" Thibault ought then to have sheathed his knife and fled, but unfortunately he remembered the oath he had taken as regards the Count, when he had found that his horse had been hamstrung. He slipped the sharp blade of his weapon under the bent knee and drew it towards him. The Count uttered a cry, but as Thibault rose from his stooping posture, he too felt a sharp pain between his shoulder blades, followed by a sensation as of extreme cold over the chest, and finally the point of a weapon appeared above his right breast. Then he saw a cloud of blood and knew no more. Lestock, called to his master's aid as the latter fell, had run to the spot, and as Thibault rose from hamstringing the Count, had seized that moment to dig his hunting knife into his back. End of chapter 17. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 18 of The Wolf Leader by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by Alfred Allinson, 1852 to 1929. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 18. Death and Resurrection. The cold morning air brought Thibault back to consciousness. He tried to rise, but the extremity of his pain held him bound. He was lying on his back, with no remembrance of what had happened, seeing only the low gray sky above him. He made another effort, and turning managed to lift himself on his elbow. As he looked around him, he began to recall the events of the previous night. He recognized the breach in the wall, and then there came back to him the memory of the love meeting with the Countess and the desperate duel with the Count. The ground near him was red with blood, but the Count was no longer there. No doubt Lestocq, who had given him this fine blow that was nailing him to the spot, had helped his master indoors. Thibault they had left there to die like a dog, as far as they cared. He had it on the tip of his tongue to hurl after them all the maledictory wishes wherewith one would like to assail one's cruelest enemy. But since Thibault had been no longer Thibault, and indeed, during the remainder of the time that he would still be the Baron Raoul, or at least so in outward appearance, his demoniacal power had been and would continue in abeyance. He had until 9 o'clock that evening, but would he live till then? The question gave rise in Thibault to a very uneasy state of mind. If he were to die before that hour, which of them would die, he or the Baron? It seemed to him as likely to be one as the other. What, however, disturbed and angered him most was his consciousness that the misfortune which had befallen him was again owing to his own fault. He remembered now that before he had expressed the wish to be the Baron for 24 hours, he had said some such words as these: "I should laugh, Raoul, if the Comte de Montgobert were to take you by surprise. You would not get off so easily as if he were the bailiff Magloire. There would be swords drawn and blows given and received." At last, with a terrible effort, and suffering the while excruciating pain, Thibault succeeded in dragging himself onto one knee. He could then make out people walking along a road not far off on their way to market, and he tried to call to them, but the blood filled his mouth and nearly choked him. So he put his hat on the point of his knife and signaled to them like a shipwrecked mariner, but his strength again failing, he once more fell back unconscious. In a little while, however, he again awoke to sensation. He appeared to be swaying from side to side as if in a boat. He opened his eyes. The peasants, it seemed, had seen him, and although not knowing who he was, had had compassion on this handsome young man lying covered with blood, and had concocted a sort of hand-burrow out of some branches on which they were now carrying him to Villers-Cotterets. But by the time they reached Puiseux, the wounded man felt that he could no longer bear the movement, and begged them to put him down in the first peasant's hut they came to, and to send a doctor to him there. The carriers took him to the house of the village priest, and left him there. Thibault, before they parted, distributed gold among them from Raoul's purse, accompanied by many thanks for all their kind offices. The priest was away saying mass, but on returning and finding the wounded man, he uttered loud cries of lamentation. Had he been Raoul himself, Thibault could not have found a better hospital. The priest had at one time been curé of Vauparfond, and while there had been engaged to give Raoul his first schooling. Like all country priests, he knew, or thought he knew, something about doctoring. So he examined his old pupil's wound. The knife had passed under the shoulder blade, through the right lung, and out between the second and third ribs. He did not for a moment disguise to himself the seriousness of the wound, but he said nothing until the doctor had been to see it. The latter arrived, and after his examination, he turned and shook his head. "Are you going to bleed him?" asked the priest. "What would be the use?" asked the doctor. "If it had been done at once after the wound was given, it might perhaps have helped to save him, but it would be dangerous now to disturb the blood in any way." "Is there any chance for him?" asked the priest, who was thinking that the less there was for the doctor to do, the more there would be for the priest. "If his wound runs the ordinary course," said the doctor, lowering his voice, "he will probably not last out the day." "You give him up, then?" A doctor never gives up a patient, or at least if he does so, he still trusts to the possibility of nature mercifully interfering on the patient's behalf. A clot may form and stop the hemorrhage. A cough may disturb the clot, and the patient bleed to death. You think, then, that it is my duty to prepare the poor young man for death? Asked the curate. I think, answered the doctor, shrugging his shoulders, you would do better to leave him alone, in the first place because he is at present in a drowsy condition, and cannot hear what you say; later on, because he will be delirious and unable to understand you. But the doctor was mistaken. The wounded man, drowsy as he was, overheard this conversation, more reassuring as regards the salvation of his soul than the recovery of his body. How many things people say in the presence of sick persons, believing that they cannot hear, while all the while they are taking in every word. In the present case, this extra acuteness of hearing may perhaps have been due to the fact that it was Thibault's soul which was awake in Raoul's body. If the soul belonging to it had been in this body, it would probably have succumbed more entirely to the effects of the wound. The doctor now dressed the wound in the back, but left the front wound uncovered, merely directing that a piece of linen soaked in ice water should be kept over it. Then, having poured some drops of a sedative into a glass of water, and telling the priest to give this to the patient whenever he asked for a drink, the doctor departed, saying that he would come again the following morning, but that he much feared that he should take his journey for nothing. Thibault would have liked to put in a word of his own, and to say himself what he thought about his condition, but his spirit was as if imprisoned in this dying body, and against his will was forced to submit to lying thus within its cell. But he could still hear the priest, who not only spoke to him, but endeavoured by shaking him to arouse him from his lethargy. Thibault found this very fatiguing, and it was lucky for the priest that the wounded man just now had no superhuman power, for he inwardly sent the good man to the devil many times over. Before long it seemed to him that some sort of hot burning pain was being inserted under the soles of his feet, his loins, his head. His blood began to circulate, then to boil like water over a fire. His ideas became confused, his clenched jaws opened, his tongue, which had been bound, became loosened, some disconnected words escaped him. Aha! He thought to himself, this no doubt is what the good doctor spoke about as delirium, and for the while at least this was his last lucid idea. His whole life, and his life had really only existed since his first acquaintance with the black wolf, passed before him. He saw himself following and failing to hit the buck, saw himself tied to the oak tree and the blows of the strap falling on him, saw himself and the black wolf drawing up their compact, saw himself trying to pass the devil's ring over to Agnelette's finger, saw himself trying to pull out the red hairs which now covered a third of his head. Then he saw himself on his way to pay court to the pretty Madame Paulet of the mill, meeting Landry and getting rid of his rival, pursued by the farm servants and followed by his wolves. He saw himself making the acquaintance of Madame Magloire, hunting for her, eating his share of the game, hiding behind the curtains, discovered by Maître Magloire, flouted by the Baron of Vez, turned out by all three. Again he saw the hollow tree with his wolves couching around it and the owls perched on its branches, and heard the sounds of the approaching violins and hautboy, and saw himself looking as Agnelette and the happy wedding party went by. He saw himself the victim of angry jealousy, endeavouring to fight against it by the help of drink, and across his troubled brain came the recollection of François, of Champagne, and the innkeeper. He heard the galloping of Baron Raoul's horse, and he felt himself knocked down and rolling in the muddy road. Then he ceased to see himself as Thibault. In his stead arose the figure of the handsome young rider whose form he had taken for a while. Once more he was kissing Lisette. Once more his lips were touching the Countess's hand. Then he was wanting to escape, but he found himself at a crossroad where three ways only met, and each of these was guarded by one of his victims. The first by the spectre of a drowned man. That was Marcotte. The second by a young man dying of fever on a hospital bed. That was Landry. The third by a wounded man dragging himself along on one knee and trying in vain to stand up on his mutilated leg. That was the Comte de Montgobert. He fancied that as all these things passed before him, he told the history of them one by one, and that the priest, as he listened to this strange confession, looked more like a dying man, was paler and more trembling than the man whose confession he was listening to, that he wanted to give him absolution, but that he, Thibault, pushed him away, shaking his head, and that he cried out in a terrible laugh, "I want no absolution! I am damned, damned, damned!" And in the midst of all of this hallucination, this delirious madness, the spirit of Thibault could hear the priest's clock striking the hours, and as they struck he counted them. Only this clock seemed to have grown to gigantic proportions, and the face of it was the blue vault of heaven, and the numbers on it were flames, and the clock was called Eternity, and the monstrous pendulum, as it swung backwards and forwards, called out in turn at every beat, "Never! Forever!" And so he lay and heard the long hours of the day pass one by one, and then at last the clock struck 9. At 9:30 he, Thibault, would have been Raoul, and Raoul would have been Thibault, for just 24 hours. As the last stroke of the hour died away, Thibault felt the fever passing from him. It was succeeded by a sensation of coldness, which almost amounted to shivering. He opened his eyes, all trembling with cold, and saw the priest at the foot of the bed, saying the prayers for the dying, and the hands of the actual clock pointing to 9:15. His senses had become so acute that, imperceptible as was their double movement, he could yet see both the larger and smaller one slowly creeping along. They were gradually nearing the critical hour, 9:30. Although the face of the clock was in darkness, it seemed illuminated by some inward light. As the minute hand approached the number 6, a spasm, becoming every instant more and more violent, shook the dying man. His feet were like ice, and the numbness slowly but steadily mounted from the feet to the knees, from the knees to the thighs, from the thighs to the lower part of the body. The sweat was running down his forehead, but he had no strength to wipe it away, nor even to ask to have it done. It was a sweat of agony, which he knew every moment might be the sweat of death. All kinds of strange shapes, which had nothing of the human about them, floated before his eyes. The light faded away, wings as of bats seemed to lift his body and carry it into some twilight region, which was neither life nor death, but seemed a part of both. Then the twilight itself grew darker and darker. His eyes closed, and like a blind man stumbling in the dark, his heavy wings seemed to flap against strange and unknown things. After that he sank away into unfathomable depths, into bottomless abysses, but still he heard the sound of a bell. The bell rang once, and scarcely had it ceased to vibrate, when the dying man uttered a cry. The priest rose and went to the side of the bed. With that cry the Baron Raoul had breathed his last. It was exactly 1 second after the half hour after 9. End of chapter 18. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 19 of The Wolf Leader by Alexandre Dumas, translated by Alfred Allinson, 1852 to 1929. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 19. The Dead and the Living. At the same moment that the trembling soul of the young Baron passed away, Thibault, awaking as if from an agitated sleep full of terrible dreams, sat up on his bed. He was surrounded by fire, every corner of his hut was in flames. At first he thought it was a continuation of his nightmare, but then he heard cries of "Death to the wizard! Death to the sorcerer! Death to the werewolf!" And he understood that some terrible attack was being made upon him. The flames came nearer, they reached the bed, he felt their heat upon him. A few seconds more, and he would be burned alive in the midst of the flaming pile. Thibault leaped from his bed, seized his boar spear, and dashed out of the back door of his hut. No sooner did his enemies see him rush through the fire and emerge from the smoke than their cries of "Death to him! Death!" were redoubled. 1 or 2 shots were fired at him. Thibault heard the bullets whiz past. Those who shot at him wore the livery of the Grand Master, and Thibault recalled the menace of the Lord of Vez uttered against him a few days before. He was then beyond the pale of the law. He could be smoked out of his hole like a fox. He could be shot down like a buck. Luckily for Thibault, not one of the bullets struck him, and as the circle of fire made by the burning hut was not a large one, he was soon safely beyond it, and once again in shelter of the vast and gloomy forest, where, had it not been for the cries of the menials who were burning down his house, the silence would have been as complete as the darkness. He sat down at the foot of a tree and buried his head in his hands. The events of the last 48 hours had succeeded each other with such rapidity that there was no lack of matter to serve as subjects of reflection to the shoemaker. The 24 hours during which he had lived another existence than his own seemed to him like a dream, so much so that he would not have dared to take his oath that all this recent affair between the Baron and the Countess Jane and the Comte de Montgobert had really taken place. The church clock of Oigny struck 10, and he lifted his head. 10 o'clock! And only half an hour before he had been still in the body of the Baron Raoul, as he lay dying in the house of the Curé de Puiseux. "Ah!" he exclaimed, "I must find out for certain what has happened. It is not quite 3 miles to Puiseux, and I shall be there in half an hour. I should like to ascertain if the Baron is really dead." A melancholy howl made answer to his words. He looked around. His faithful bodyguards were back again. He had his pack about him once more. "Come, my wolves, come, my only friends," he cried, "let us be off." And he started with them across the forest in the direction of Puiseux. The huntsmen of the Lord of Vez, who were poking up the remaining embers of the ruined hut, saw a man pass as in a vision, running at the head of a dozen or more wolves. They crossed themselves, and became more convinced than ever that Thibault was a wizard. And anybody else who had seen Thibault flying along as swiftly as his swiftest wolf, and covering the ground between Oigny and Puiseux in less than a quarter of an hour, would certainly have thought so too. He stopped at the entrance to the village, and turned to his wolves. He said, "Friend wolves, I have no further need of you tonight, and indeed I wish to be alone. Amuse yourselves with the stables in the neighborhood. I give you leave to do just what you like, and if you chance to come across one of these 2-footed animals called men, forget, friend wolves, that they claim to be made in the image of their Creator, and never fear to satisfy your appetite." Whereupon the wolves rushed off in different directions, uttering howls of joy, while Thibault went on into the village. The curé's house adjoined the church, and Thibault made a circuit so as to avoid passing in front of the cross. When he reached the presbytery, he looked in through one of the windows, and there he saw a bed with a lighted wax candle beside it, and over the bed itself was spread a sheet, and beneath the sheet could be seen the outlines of a figure lying rigid in death. There appeared to be no one in the house, so the priest had no doubt gone to give notice of the death to the village authorities. Thibault went inside, and called the priest, but no one answered. He walked up to the bed. There could be no mistake about the body under the sheet being that of a dead man. He lifted the sheet. There could be no mistaking that the dead body was that of Raoul de Vauparfond. On his face lay the still unearthly beauty which is born of eternity. His features, which in life had been somewhat too feminine for those of a man, had now assumed the sombre grandeur of death. At the first glance you might have thought he only slept, but on gazing longer you recognized in that immovable calm something more profound than sleep. The presence of one who carries a sickle for scepter and wears a shroud for mantle was unmistakable, and you knew King Death was there. Thibault had left the door open, and he heard the sound of light footsteps approaching. At the back of the alcove hung a serge curtain, which masked a door by which he could retreat if necessary, and he now went and placed himself behind it. A woman dressed in black and covered with a black veil paused in some hesitation at the door. The head of another woman passed in front of hers and looked carefully round the room. "I think it's safe for Madame to go in. I see no one about, and besides, I will keep watch." The woman in black went in, walked slowly towards the bed, stopped a moment to wipe the perspiration from her forehead, then without further hesitation lifted the sheet which Thibault had thrown back over the face of the dead man. Thibault then saw that it was the Countess. "Alas," she said, "what they told me was true." Then she fell on her knees, praying and sobbing. Her prayer being ended, she rose again, kissed the pale forehead of the dead, and the blue marks of the wound through which the soul had fled. "Oh, my well-beloved, my Raoul," she murmured, "who will tell me the name of your murderer? Who will help me to avenge your death?" As the Countess finished speaking, she gave a cry and started back. She seemed to hear a voice that answered, "I will," and something had shaken the green serge curtain. The Countess, however, was no chicken-hearted woman. She took the candle that was burning at the head of the bed, and went and looked behind the curtain, but no creature was to be seen. A closed door was all that met her eye. She put back the candle, took a pair of gold scissors from a little pocket case, cut off a curl of the dead man's hair, placed the curl in a black velvet satchel which hung over her heart, gave one last kiss to her dead lover, laid the sheet over his face, and left the house. Just as she was crossing the threshold, she met the priest, and drawing back, drew her veil more closely over her face. "Who are you?" asked the priest. "I am Grief," she answered, and the priest made way for her to pass. The Countess and her attendant had come on foot and were returning in the same manner, for the distance between Puiseux and Montgobert was not much more than half a mile. When about halfway along their road, a man who had been hiding behind a willow tree stepped forward and barred their further passage. Lisette screamed, but the Countess, without the least sign of fear, went up to the man and asked, "Who are you?" "The man who answered 'I will' just now, when you were asking who would denounce the murderer to you." "And you can help me to revenge myself on him?" "Whenever you like." "At once?" "We cannot talk here very well." "Where can we find a better place?" "In your own room, for one." "We must not enter the castle together." "No, but I can go through the breach in the park wall. Mademoiselle Lisette can wait for me in the hut where Monsieur Raoul used to leave his horse. She can take me up the winding stair and into your room. If you should be in your dressing room, I will wait for you as Monsieur Raoul waited the night before last." The two women shuddered from head to foot. "Who are you to know all these details?" asked the Countess. "I will tell you when the time comes for me to tell you." The Countess hesitated a moment, then recovering her resolutions, she said, "Very well, then, come through the breach. Lisette will wait for you in the stable." "Oh, madame," cried the maid, "I shall never dare to go and bring that man to you." "I will go myself, then," said the Countess. "Well said," put in Thibault, "there spoke a woman worth calling one." And so saying, he slid down into a kind of ravine beside the road and disappeared. Lisette nearly fainted. "Lean on me, mademoiselle," said the Countess, "and let us walk on. I am anxious to hear what this man has to say to me." The two women entered the castle by way of the farm. No one had seen them go out, and no one saw them return. On reaching her room, the Countess waited for Lisette to bring up the stranger. 10 minutes had elapsed when the maid hurried in with a pale face. "Ah, madame," she said, "there was no need for me to go to fetch him." "What do you mean?" asked the Countess. "Because he knew his way up as well as I did, and oh, madame, if you knew what he said to me, that man is the devil, madame, I feel sure." "Show him in," said the Countess. "I am here," said Thibault. "You can leave us now, my girl," said the Countess to Lisette. The latter quitted the room, and the Countess remained alone with Thibault. Thibault's appearance was not one to inspire confidence. He gave the impression of a man who had once and for all made up his mind, but it was also easy to see that it was for no good purpose. A satanic smile played about his mouth, and there was a demoniacal light in his eyes. He had made no attempt to hide his red hairs, but had left them defiantly uncovered, and they hung over his forehead like a plume of flame. But still the Countess looked him full in the face without changing color. "My maid says that you know the way to my room. Have you ever been here before?" "Yes, madame, once." "And when was that?" "The day before yesterday." "At what time?" "From 10:30 till 12:30 at night." The Countess looked steadily at him and said, "That is not true." "Would you like me to tell you what took place?" "During the time you mention?" "During the time I mentioned." "Say on," replied the Countess, laconically. Thibault was equally laconic. "Monsieur Raoul came in by that door," he said, pointing to the one leading into the corridor, "and Lisette left him here alone. You entered the room by that one," he continued, indicating the dressing-room door, "and you found him on his knees. Your hair was unbound, only fastened back by 3 diamond pins. You wore a pink silk dressing gown trimmed with lace, pink silk stockings, cloth of silver slippers, and a chain of pearls round your neck." "You describe my dress exactly," said the Countess. "Continue." "You tried to pick a quarrel with Monsieur Raoul, first because he loitered in the corridors to kiss your waiting maid, secondly because someone had met him late at night on the road between Erneville and Villers-Cotterets, thirdly because at the ball given at the castle, at which you yourself were not present, he danced 4 times with Madame de Bonneuil." "Continue." "In answer to your accusations, your lover made excuses for himself, some good, some bad. You, however, were satisfied with them, for you were just forgiving him, when Lisette rushed in, full of alarm, calling to Monsieur Raoul to escape, as your husband had just returned." "Lisette was right. You can be nothing less than the devil," said the Countess with a sinister laugh. "I think we shall be able to do business together. Finish your account." "Then you and your maid together pushed Monsieur Raoul, who resisted, into the dressing room. Lisette forced him along the corridors and through 2 of the 3 rooms. They then went down a winding staircase in the wing of the castle opposite to one by which they had gone up. On arriving at the foot of the staircase, the fugitives found the door locked. Then they ran into a kind of office where Lisette opened the window, which was about 7 or 8 feet above the ground. Monsieur Raoul leaped down out of this window, ran to the stable, found his horse still there, but hamstrung. Then he swore that if he met the Count at any time, he would hamstring him as the Count had hamstrung his horse, for he thought it a cowardly act to injure a poor beast so unnecessarily. Then he went on foot to the breach, climbed it, and found the Count awaiting him outside the park with his sword drawn. The Baron had his hunting knife with him. He drew it, and the duel began. "Was the Count alone?" "Wait." The Count appeared to be alone. After the 4th or 5th pass, the Count was wounded in the shoulder, and sank on one knee, crying, "Help, Lestocq!" Then the Baron remembered his oath, and hamstrung the Count as he had hamstrung the horse. But as the Baron rose, Lestocq drove his knife into his back. It passed under the shoulder blade and out through the chest. I need not tell you where. You kissed the wound yourself. "And after that?" The Count and his huntsman returned to the castle, leaving the Baron lying helpless. When the latter came to, he made signs to some passing peasants, who put him on a litter and bore him away, with the intention of taking him to Villers-Cotterets. But he was in such pain that they could not carry him farther than Puiseux. There they laid him on the bed where you found him, and on which he breathed his last a second after the half hour after 9 in the evening. The Countess rose, and without speaking went to her jewel case and took out the pearls she had worn 2 nights before. She handed them to Thibault. "What are they for?" he asked. "Take them," said the Countess. "They are worth 50,000 livres." "Are you still anxious for revenge?" "Yes," replied the Countess. "Revenge will cost more than that." "How much will it cost?" "Wait for me tomorrow night," said Thibault, "and I will tell you." "Where shall I await you?" asked the Countess. "Here," said Thibault, with the leer of a wild animal. "I will await you here," said the Countess. "Till tomorrow, then." "Till tomorrow." Thibault went out. The Countess went and replaced the pearls in her dressing case, lifted up a false bottom, and drew from underneath it a small bottle containing an opal-colored liquid, and a little dagger with a jeweled handle and case, and a blade inlaid with gold. She hid both beneath her pillow, knelt at her prie-dieu, and, her prayer finished, threw herself dressed onto her bed. End of Chapter 19. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 20 of The Wolf Leader by Alexandre Dumas, translated by Alfred Allinson, 1852–1929. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 20. True to Tryst. On quitting the Countess's room, Thibault had left the castle by the way which he had described to her, and soon found himself safe beyond its walls and outside the park. And now, for the first time in his life, Thibault had really nowhere to go. His hut was burnt, he was without a friend, and, like Cain, he was a wanderer on the face of the earth. He turned to the unfailing shelter of the forest, and there made his way to the lower end of Chavigny. As the day was breaking, he came across a solitary house, and asked if he could buy some bread. The woman belonging to it, her husband being away, gave him some, but refused to receive payment for it. His appearance frightened her. Having now food sufficient for the day, Thibault returned to the forest, with the intention of spending his time till evening in a part which he knew between Fleury and Longpont, where the trees were especially thick and tall. As he was looking for a resting place beyond a rock, his eye was attracted by a shining object lying at the bottom of a slope, and his curiosity led him to climb down and see what it was. The shining object was the silver badge belonging to a huntsman's shoulder belt. The shoulder belt was slung round the neck of a dead body, or rather of a skeleton, for the flesh had been entirely eaten off the bones, which were as clean as if prepared for an anatomist's study or a painter's studio. The skeleton looked as if it had only lain there since the preceding night. "Ha, ha!" said Thibault, "this is probably the work of my friends the wolves. They evidently profited by the permission which I gave them." Curious to know, if possible, who the victim was, he examined it more closely. His curiosity was soon satisfied, for the badge, which the wolves had no doubt rejected as less easily digestible than the rest, was lying on the chest of the skeleton, like a ticket on a bale of goods. J. B. Lestocq, head keeper to the Comte de Montgobert. "Well done," laughed Thibault. "Here is one at least who did not live long to enjoy the result of his murderous act." Then, contracting his brow, he muttered to himself in a low voice, and this time without laughing, "Is there perhaps, after all, what people call a providence?" Lestocq's death was not difficult to account for. He had probably been executing some order for his master that night, and on the road between Montgobert and Longpont had been attacked by wolves. He had defended himself with the same knife with which he had wounded the Baron, for Thibault found the knife a few paces off, at a spot where the ground showed traces of a severe struggle. At last, being disarmed, the ferocious beasts had dragged him into the hollow, and there devoured him. Thibault was becoming so indifferent to everything that he felt neither pleasure nor regret, neither satisfaction nor remorse at Lestocq's death. All he thought was that it simplified matters for the Countess, as she would now only have her husband upon whom she need revenge herself. Then he went and found a place where the rocks afforded him the best shelter from the wind, and prepared to spend his day there in peace. Towards midday he heard the horn of the Lord of Vez, and the cry of his hounds. The mighty huntsman was after game, but the chase did not pass near enough to Thibault to disturb him. At last the night came. At 9 o'clock Thibault rose and set out for the castle of Montgobert. He found the breach, followed the path he knew, and came to the little hut where Lisette had been awaiting him on the night when he had come in the guise of Raoul. The poor girl was there this evening, but alarmed and trembling. Thibault wished to carry out the old traditions and tried to kiss her, but she sprang back with visible signs of fear. "Do not touch me," she said, "or I shall call out." "Oh, indeed, my pretty one," said Thibault, "you were not so sour-tempered the other day with the Baron Raoul." "Maybe not," said the girl, "but a great many things have happened since the other day." "And many more to happen still," said Thibault in a lively tone. "I think," said the waiting maid in a mournful voice, "that the climax is already reached." Then, as she went on in front, "If you wish to come," she added, "follow me." Thibault followed her. Lisette, without the slightest effort at concealment, walked straight across the open space that lay between the trees and the castle. "You are courageous to-day," said Thibault, "and supposing someone were to see us?" "There is no fear now," she answered. "The eyes that could have seen us are all closed." Although he did not understand what the young girl meant by these words, the tone in which they were spoken made Thibault shiver. He continued to follow her in silence as they went up the winding stairs to the first floor. As Lisette laid her hand on the key of the door, Thibault suddenly stopped her. Something in the silence and solitude of the castle filled him with fear. It seemed as if a curse might have fallen on the place. "Where are we going?" said Thibault, scarcely knowing himself what he said. "You know well enough, surely." "Into the Countess's room?" "Into the Countess's room." "She is waiting for me?" "She is waiting for you." And Lisette opened the door. "Go in," she said. Thibault went in, and Lisette shut the door behind him and waited outside. It was the same exquisite room, lighted in the same manner, filled with the same sweet scent. Thibault looked round for the Countess. He expected to see her appear at the dressing room door, but the door remained closed. Not a sound was to be heard in the room, except the ticking of the Sevres clock and the beating of Thibault's heart. He began to look about him with a feeling of shuddering fear for which he could not account. Then his eyes fell on the bed. The Countess was lying asleep upon it. In her hair were the same diamond pins, round her neck the same pearls. She was dressed in the same pink silk dressing gown, and had on the same little slippers of cloth of silver which she had worn to receive the Baron Raoul. Thibault went up to her. The Countess did not stir. "You are sleeping, fair Countess," he said, leaning over to look at her. But all at once he started upright, staring before him, his hair standing on end, the sweat breaking out on his forehead. The terrible truth was beginning to dawn upon him. Was the Countess sleeping the sleep of this world or of eternity? He fetched a light from the mantelpiece, and with trembling hand held it to the face of the mysterious sleeper. It was pale as ivory, with the delicate veins traced over the temples and the lips still red. A drop of pink burning wax fell on this still face of sleep, and it did not awake the Countess. "Ah!" cried Thibault, "what is this?" And he put down the candle, which his shaking hand could no longer hold, on the night table. The Countess lay with her arms stretched out close to her sides. She appeared to be clasping something in either hand. With some effort Thibault was able to open the left one. Within it he found the little bottle which she had taken from her dressing case the night before. He opened the other hand. Within it lay a piece of paper on which were written these few words: "True to tryst." Yes, true and faithful unto death, for the Countess was dead. All Thibault's illusions were fading one after the other, like the dreams of the night which gradually fade away, as the sleeper becomes more and more thoroughly awake. There was a difference, however, for other men find their dead alive again in their dreams, but with Thibault, his dead did not arise and walk, but remained lying for ever in their last sleep. He wiped his forehead, went to the door leading into the corridor, and opened it to find Lisette on her knees praying. "Is the Countess dead, then?" asked Thibault. "The Countess is dead, and the Count is dead." "From the effect of the wounds given him by the Baron Raoul?" "No, from the blow with the dagger given him by the Countess." "Ah!" said Thibault, grimacing hideously in his effort to force a laugh in the midst of this grim drama. "Oh, this tale you hint at is new to me." Then Lisette told him the tale in full. It was a plain tale, but a terrible one. The Countess had remained in bed part of the day, listening to the village bells of Puiseux, which were tolling as the Baron's body was being borne from thence to Vauparfond, where he was to be laid in the family grave. Towards 4 o'clock the bells ceased. Then the Countess rose, took the dagger from under her pillow, hid it in her breast, and went towards her husband's room. She found the valet in attendance in good spirits. The doctor had just left, having examined the wound and declared the Count's life out of danger. "Madame will agree that it is a thing to rejoice at," said the valet. "Yes, to rejoice at, indeed." And the Countess went on into her husband's room. 5 minutes later she left it again. "The Count is sleeping," she said. "Do not go in until he calls." The valet bowed and sat down in the ante-room, to be in readiness at the first call from his master. The Countess went back to her room. "Undress me, Lisette," she said to her waiting maid, "and give me the clothes that I had on the last time he came." The maid obeyed. We have already seen how every detail of toilet was arranged exactly as it had been on that fatal night. Then the Countess wrote a few words on a piece of paper, which she folded and kept in her right hand. After that she lay down on her bed. "Will Madame not take anything?" asked the maid. The Countess opened her left hand and showed her a little bottle she was holding inside it. "Yes, Lisette," she said, "I am going to take what is in this bottle." "What? Nothing but that?" said Lisette. "It will be enough, Lisette, for after I have taken it, I shall have need of nothing more." And as she spoke, she put the bottle to her mouth and drank the contents at a draught. Then she said, "You saw that man, Lisette, who waited for us in the road. I have a meeting with him this evening, here in my room at 9:30. You know where to go and wait for him, and you will bring him here. I do not wish that any one should be able to say that I was not true to my word, even after I am dead." Thibault had nothing to say. The agreement made between them had been kept. Only the Countess had accomplished her revenge herself, single handed, as everyone understood when the valet, feeling uneasy about his master and going softly into his room to look at him, found him lying on his back with a dagger in his heart, and then hurrying to tell Madame what had happened, found the Countess dead also. The news of this double death soon spread through the castle, and all the servants had fled, saying that the exterminating angel was in the castle. The waiting maid alone remained to carry out her dead mistress's wishes. Thibault had nothing more to do at the castle, so he left the Countess on her bed with Lisette near her and went down the stairs. As Lisette had said, there was no fear now of meeting either master or servants. The servants had run away, the master and mistress were dead. Thibault once more made for the breach in the wall. The sky was dark, and if it had not been January, you might have imagined a thunderstorm was brewing. There was barely light enough to see the footpath as he went along. Once or twice Thibault paused. He fancied he had detected the sound of the dry branches cracking under someone's footsteps, keeping pace with his, both to right and left. Having come to the breach, Thibault distinctly heard a voice say, "That's the man!" And at the same moment 2 gendarmes, concealed on the farther side of the wall, seized Thibault by the collar, while 2 others came up behind. It appeared that Cramoisi, jealous with regard to Lisette, had been prowling about at nights on the watch, and had only this evening before noticed a strange man come in and go out of the park along the more secluded paths, and he had reported the fact to the head of the police. When the recent serious events that had taken place at the castle became generally known, orders were given to send 4 men and take up any suspicious-looking person seen prowling about. 2 of the men, with Cramoisi for guide, had ambushed on the farther side of the breach, and the 2 others had dogged Thibault through the park. Then, as we have seen, at the signal given by Cramoisi, they had all 4 fallen upon him as he issued from the breach. There was a long and obstinate struggle. Thibault was not a man that even 4 others could overcome without difficulty, but he had no weapon by him, and his resistance was therefore useless. The gendarmes had been more bent on securing him on account of having recognized that it was Thibault, and Thibault was beginning to earn a very bad name, so many misfortunes having become associated with it. So Thibault was knocked down and finally bound and led off between 2 mounted men. The other 2 gendarmes walked one in front and one behind. Thibault had merely struggled out of a natural feeling of self-defense and pride, for his power to inflict evil was, as we know, unlimited, and he had but to wish his assailants dead, and they would have fallen lifeless at his feet. But he thought there was time enough for that. As long as there still remained a wish to him, he could escape from man's justice, even though he were at the foot of the scaffold. So Thibault, securely bound, his hands tied, and fetters upon his feet, walked along between his 4 gendarmes, apparently in a state of resignation. One of the gendarmes held the end of the rope with which he was bound, and the 4 men made jokes and laughed at him, asking the wizard Thibault why, being possessed of such power, he had allowed himself to be taken. And Thibault replied to their scoffings with the well-known proverb, "He laughs best who laughs last," and the gendarmes expressed a wish that they might be the ones to do so. On leaving Puiseux behind, they came to the forest. The weather was growing more and more threatening. The dark clouds hung so low that the trees looked as if they were holding up a huge black veil, and it was impossible to see 4 steps ahead. But he, Thibault, saw lights swiftly passing and crossing one another in the darkness on either side. Closer and closer drew the lights, and pattering footfalls were heard among the dry leaves. The horses became restive, shied, and snorted, sniffing the air and trembling beneath their riders, while the coarse laughter of the men themselves died down. It was Thibault's turn to laugh now. "What are you laughing at?" asked one of the gendarmes. "I am laughing at your having left off laughing," said Thibault. The lights drew nearer, and the footfalls became more distinct, at the sound of Thibault's voice. Then a more ominous sound was heard, a sound of teeth striking together as jaws opened and shut. "Yes, yes, my friend," said Thibault, "you have tasted human flesh, and you found it good." He was answered by a low growl of approbation, half like a dog's and half like a hyena's. "Quite so," said Thibault, "I understand, after having made a meal of a keeper, you would not mind tasting a gendarme." The gendarmes themselves were beginning to shudder with fear. "To whom are you talking?" they asked him. "To those who can answer me," said Thibault, and he gave a howl. 20 or more howls responded, some from close at hand, some from farther off. "Hm," said one of the gendarmes, What are these beasts that are following us? This good-for-nothing seems to understand their language." "Wait," said the shoemaker. "You take Thibault, the wolf master, prisoner. You carry him through the forest at night, and then you ask what are the lights and the howls that follow him. Do you hear, friends?" cried Thibault. "These gentlemen are asking who you are. Answer them, all of you together, that they may have no further doubt on the matter." The wolves, obedient to their master's voice, gave one prolonged, unanimous howl. The horses panted and shivered, and one or two of them reared. The gendarmes endeavored to calm their animals, patting and gentling them. "That is nothing," said Thibault. "Wait till you see each horse with two wolves hanging on to its hindquarters and another at its throat." The wolves now came in between the horses' legs and began caressing Thibault. One of them stood up and put its front paws on Thibault's chest, as if asking for orders. "Presently, presently," said Thibault. "There is plenty of time. Do not be selfish. Give your comrades time to come up." The men could no longer control their horses, which were rearing and shying, and although going at a foot's pace, were streaming with sweat. "Do you not think," said Thibault, "you would do best now to come to terms with me? That is, if you were to let me free on condition that you all sleep in your beds tonight." "Go at a walking pace," said one of the gendarmes. "As long as we do that, we have nothing to fear." Another one drew his sword. A second or two later there was a howl of pain. One of the wolves had seized hold of this gendarme's boot, and the latter had pierced him through with his weapon. "I call that a very imprudent thing to do," said Thibault. "The wolves eat each other, whatever the proverb may say, and once having tasted blood, I do not know that even I shall have the power to hold them back." The wolves threw themselves in a body on their wounded comrade, and in 5 minutes there was nothing left of its carcass but the bare bones. The gendarmes had profited by this respite to get on ahead, but without releasing Thibault, whom they obliged to run alongside of them. What he had foreseen, however, happened. There was a sudden sound as of an approaching hurricane. The whole pack was in pursuit, following them up at full gallop. The horses, having once started trotting, refused to go at a walking pace again, and frightened by the stamping, the smell, and the howls, now set off galloping in spite of their riders' efforts to hold them in. The man who had hold of the rope, now requiring both hands to master his horse, let go of Thibault, and the wolves leaped on to the horses, clinging desperately to the cruppers and withers and throats of the terrified animals. No sooner had the latter felt the sharp teeth of their assailants than they scattered, rushing in every direction. "Hurrah, wolves, hurrah!" cried Thibault. But the fierce animals had no need of encouragement, and soon each horse had 6 or 7 more wolves in pursuit of him. Horses and wolves disappeared, some one way, some the other, and the men's cries of distress, the agonized neighings of the horses, and the furious howls of the wolves became gradually fainter and fainter as they travelled farther away. Thibault was left free once more and alone. His hands, however, were still bound and his feet fettered. First he tried to undo the cord with his teeth, but this he found impossible. Then he tried to wrench his bonds apart by the power of his muscles, but that too was unavailing. The only result of his efforts was to make the cord cut into his flesh. It was his turn to bellow with pain and anger. At last, tired of trying to wrest his hands free, he lifted them, bound as they were, to heaven, and cried, "O black wolf, friend, let these cords that bind me be loosened. Thou knowest well that it is only to do evil that I wish for my hands to be free." And at that same moment his fetters were broken and fell to the ground, and Thibault beat his hands together with another roar, this time of joy. End of chapter 20. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 21 of The Wolf Leader by Alexandre Dumas, translated by Alfred Allinson, 1852 to 1929. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 21. The Genius of Evil. The next evening, about 9 o'clock, a man might be seen walking along the Puits Sarrasin road and making for the Alcière forest path. It was Thibault, on his way to pay a last visit to the hut, and to see if any remains of it had been left by the fire. A heap of smoking cinders alone marked the place where it had stood, and as Thibault came in sight of it, he saw the wolves, as if he had appointed them to meet him there, forming an immense circle round the ruins, and looking upon them with an expression of mournful anger. They seemed to understand that by destroying this poor hut, made of earth and branches, the one who, by the compact with the black wolf, had been given them for master and had been made a victim. As Thibault entered the circle, all the wolves gave simultaneously a long and sinister-sounding howl, as if to make him understand that they were ready to help in avenging him. Thibault went and sat down on the spot where the hearth had stood. It was recognizable from a few blackened stones still remaining, which were otherwise uninjured, and by a higher heap of cinders just at that spot. He stayed there for some minutes, absorbed in his unhappy thoughts. But he was not reflecting that the ruin which he saw around him was the consequence and the punishment of his jealous and covetous desires, which had gone on gathering strength. He felt neither repentance nor regret. That which dominated all other feeling in him was his satisfaction at the thought of being henceforth able to render to his fellow creatures evil for evil, his pride in having, thanks to his terrible auxiliaries, the power to fight against those who persecuted him. And as the wolves continued their melancholy howling, "Yes, my friends," said Thibault, "yes, your howls answer to the cry of my heart. My fellow creatures have destroyed my hut. They have cast to the winds the ashes of the tools wherewith I earned my daily bread. Their hatred pursues me as it pursues you. I expect from them neither mercy nor pity. We are their enemies as they are ours, and I will have neither mercy nor compassion on them. Come then, let us go from this hut to the castle and carry thither the destruction which they have brought home to me." And then the master of the wolves, like a chief of banditti, followed by his desperadoes, set off with his pack in quest of pillage and carnage. This time it was neither red deer nor fallow deer, nor any timid game of which they were in pursuit. Sheltered by the darkness of the night, Thibault first directed his course to the chateau of Vez, for there was lodged his chief enemy. The Baron had 3 farms belonging to the estate, stables filled with horses and others filled with cows, and the park was full of sheep. All these places were attacked the first night, and on the morrow 2 horses, 4 cows, and 10 sheep were found killed. The Baron was doubtful at first if this could be the work of the beasts against which he waged so fierce a warfare. There seemed something partaking rather of intelligence and revenge in it than of the mere unreasoning attacks of a pack of wild animals. Still it seemed manifest that the wolves must have been the aggressors, judging by the marks of the teeth on the carcasses and the footprints left on the ground. Next night the Baron set watchers to lie in wait, but Thibault and his wolves were at work on the farther side of the forest. This time it was the stables and parks of Soucy and of Viviers which were decimated, and the following night those of Bourson and Ivors. The work of annihilation once begun must be carried out with desperate determination, and the master never left his wolves now. He slept with them in their dens and lived in the midst of them, stimulating their thirst for blood. Many a woodman, many a heath-gatherer came face to face in the thickets with the menacing white teeth of a wolf, and was either carried off and eaten, or just saved his life by the aid of his courage and his bill-hook. Guided by a human intelligence, the wolves had become organized and disciplined, and were far more formidable than a band of discontented soldiery let loose in a conquered country. The terror of them became general. No one dared go beyond the towns and villages unarmed. Horses and cattle were all fed inside the stables, and the men themselves, their work done, waited for one another, so as not to go about singly. The Bishop of Soissons ordered public prayer to be made, asking God to send a thaw, for the unusual ferocity of the wolves was attributed to the great quantity of snow that had fallen. But the report also went about that the wolves were incited to their work and led about by a man, that this man was more indefatigable, more cruel and insatiable than the wolves themselves, that in imitation of his companions he ate raw flesh and quenched his thirst in blood, and the people went further and said that this man was Thibault. The bishop pronounced sentence of excommunication against the former shoemaker. The Lord of Vez, however, had little faith in the thunders of the church being of much effect, unless supported by some well-conducted hunting. He was somewhat cast down at so much blood being spilt, and his pride was sorely hurt that his, the Grand Master's, own cattle should have suffered so heavily from the very wolves he was especially appointed to destroy. At the same time he could not but feel a secret delight at the thought of the triumphant view halloos in store for him, and of the fame which he could not fail to win among all sportsmen of repute. His passion for the chase, excited by the way in which his adversaries the wolves had so openly entered upon the struggle, became absolutely overpowering. He allowed neither respite nor repose, he took no sleep himself, and ate his meals in the saddle. All night long he scoured the country in company with l'Eveillé and Engoulevent, who, in consideration of his marriage, had been raised to the rank of pricker. And the dawn had no sooner appeared before he was again in the saddle, ready to start and chase the wolf until it was too dark to distinguish the hounds. But alas, all his knowledge of the art of venery, all his courage, all his perseverance were lost labor. He occasionally brought down some wretched cub, some miserable beast eaten with mange, some imprudent glutton which had so gorged itself with carnage that its breath would not hold out after an hour or two's run. But the larger, well-grown wolves, with their thick dark coats, their muscles like steel springs, and their long slender feet, not one of these lost a hair in the war that was being made upon them. Thanks to Thibault, they met their enemies in arms on nearly equal ground. As the Baron of Vez remained for ever with his dogs, so did Thibault with his wolves. After a night of sack and pillage, he kept the pack awake on the watch to help the one that the Baron had started. This wolf, again following Thibault's instructions, had recourse at first to stratagem. It doubled, crossed its tracks, waded in the streams, leapt up into the bending trees so as to make it more difficult still for huntsmen and hounds to follow the scent, and finally, when it felt its powers failing, it adopted bolder measures and went straight ahead. Then the other wolves and their master intervened. At the least sign of hesitation on the part of the hounds, they managed so cleverly to put them on the wrong scent that it required an experienced eye to detect that the dogs were not all following up the same track, and nothing less than the Baron's profound knowledge could decide which was the right one. Even he sometimes was mistaken. Again the wolves in their turn followed the huntsmen. It was a pack hunting a pack. Only the one hunted in silence, which made it far the more formidable of the two. Did a tired hound fall behind, or another get separated from the main body, it was seized and killed in an instant. And Engoulevent, whom we have had occasion to mention several times before, and who had taken poor Marcotte's place, having hastened one day to the help of one of his hounds that was uttering cries of distress, was himself attacked and only owed his life to the swiftness of his horse. It was not long before the Baron's pack was decimated. His best hounds were nearly dead with fatigue, and his more second-rate ones had perished by the wolves' teeth. The stable was in no better condition than the kennel. Bayard was foundered, Tancred had sprained a tendon leaping over a ditch, and a strained fetlock had placed Valoris on the list of invalids. Sultan, luckier than his three companions, had fallen honorably on the field of battle, having succumbed to a 16 hours' run under the weight of his gigantic master, who never for a moment lost courage, notwithstanding the fact that the dead bodies of his finest and most faithful servitors lay heaped around him. The Baron, following the example of the noble-hearted Romans who exhausted the resources of military art against the Carthaginians, who were for ever reappearing as enemies, the Baron, I repeat, changed his tactics and tried what battues could accomplish. He called on all available men among the peasants, and beat up the game throughout the forest with such a formidable number of men that not so much as a hair was left in its form near any spot which they had passed. But Thibault made it his business to find out beforehand where these battues were going to take place, and if he ascertained that the beaters were on the side of the forest towards Viviers or Soucy, he and his wolves made an excursion to Borson or Ivors, and if the Baron and his men were busy near Haramont or Longpré, the people of Courcy and Vertefeuille were made painfully aware of Thibault and his wolves. In vain the Lord of Vez drew his cordon at night round the suspected enclosures, so as to begin the attack with daylight. Never once did his men succeed in starting a wolf, for not once did Thibault make a mistake in his calculations. If by chance he had not been well informed, and was uncertain in what direction the Baron and his men were going, he called all his wolves together, sending express couriers after them as the night set in. He then led them unobserved down the wooded lane leading to Lissart-l'Abbesse, which at that time ran between the forest of Compiègne and the forest of Villers-Cotterets, and so was able to pass from one to the other. This state of things went on for several months. Both the Baron and Thibault carried out the task each had set before himself with equally passionate energy. The latter, like his adversary, seemed to have required some supernatural power, whereby he was able to resist fatigue and excitement, and this was the more remarkable, seeing that during the short intervals of respite accorded by the Lord of Vez, the wolf leader was by no means at peace in himself. It was not that the terrible deeds in which he was an active agent and at which he presided, filled him exactly with horror, for he thought them justifiable. He threw the responsibility of them, he said, on to those who had forced him to commit them, but there were moments of failing spirit for which he could not account, when he went about in the midst of his ferocious companions, feeling gloomy, morose, and heavy-hearted. Again, the image of Agnelette would rise before him, seeming to him like the personification of his own past life, honest and laborious, peaceful and innocent, and more than that, he felt he loved her more than he had ever thought it possible for him to love anybody. At times he would weep at the thought of all his lost happiness, at others he was seized with a wild fit of jealousy against the one to whom she now belonged, she who at one time might, if he had liked, have been his. One day the Baron, in order to prepare some fresh means of destruction, had been forced for the while to leave the wolves in peace. Thibault, who was in one of the moods we have just described, wandered forth from the den where he lived, in company with the wolves. It was a splendid summer's night, and he began to rove about the woodlands, where the moon was lighting up the trunks of the trees, dreaming of the time when he trod the mossy carpet underfoot free from trouble and anxiety, until at last the only happiness which was now left him, forgetfulness of the present, stole over his senses. Lost in this sweet dream of his earlier life, he was all of a sudden aroused by a cry of distress from somewhere near at hand. He was now so accustomed to such sounds that ordinarily he would have paid no attention to it, but his heart was for the moment softened by the recollection of Agnelette, and he felt more disposed than usual to pity. As it happened also, he was near the place where he had first seen the gentle child, and this helped to awaken his kinder nature. He ran to the spot whence the cry had come, and as he leaped from the underwood into the deep forest lane near Ham, he saw a woman struggling with an immense wolf, which had thrown her on the ground. Thibault could not have said why he was so agitated at this sight, nor why his heart beat more violently than usual. He rushed forward, and seizing the animal by the throat, hurled it away from its victim, and then lifting the woman in his arms, he carried her to the side of the lane and laid her on the slope. Here a ray of moonlight breaking through the clouds fell on the face of the woman he had saved, and Thibault saw that it was Agnelette. Near to the spot was the spring in which Thibault had once gazed at himself, and had seen the first red hair. He ran to it, took up water in his hands, and threw it into the woman's face. Agnelette opened her eyes and gave a cry of terror, and tried to rise and flee. "What?" cried the wolf leader, as if he were still Thibault the shoemaker. "You do not know me again, Agnelette?" "Ah, yes, indeed I know you, Thibault, and it is because I know who you are," cried the young woman, "that I am afraid." Then throwing herself on her knees and clasping her hands, "Oh, do not kill me, Thibault," she cried, "do not kill me. It would be such dreadful trouble for the poor old grandmother. Thibault, do not kill me." The wolf leader stood overcome with consternation. Up to this hour he had not fully realized the hideous renown which he had gained, but the terror which the sight of him inspired in the woman who had loved him and whom he still loved filled him with a horror of himself. "I kill you, Agnelette," he said, "just when I have snatched you from death? Oh, how you must hate and despise me for such a thought to enter your head." "I do not hate you, Thibault," said the young woman, "but I hear such things about you that I feel afraid of you." "And do they say nothing of the infidelity which has led Thibault to commit such crimes?" "I do not understand you," said Agnelette, looking at Thibault with her large eyes, blue as the heavens. "What?" exclaimed Thibault, "you do not understand that I loved you, that I adored you, Agnelette, and that the loss of you sent me out of my mind?" "If you loved me, if you adored me, Thibault, what prevented you from marrying me?" "The spirit of evil," muttered Thibault. "I too loved you," continued the young woman, "and I suffered cruelly waiting for you." Thibault heaved a sigh. "You loved me, Agnelette?" he asked. "Yes," replied the young woman with her soft voice and gentle eyes. "But now all is over," said Thibault, "and you love me no more." "Thibault," answered Agnelette, "I no longer love you because it is no longer right to love you, but one cannot always forget one's first love as one would wish." "Agnelette," cried Thibault, trembling all over, "be careful what you say." "Why should I be careful what I say, since it is the truth?" said the girl, with an innocent shake of the head. "The day you told me that you wished to make me your wife, I believed you, Thibault, for why should I think that you would lie to me when I had just done you a service? Then later I met you, but I did not go in search of you. You came to me, you spoke words of love to me, you were the first to refer to the promise that you had made me, and it was not my fault either, Thibault, that I was afraid of that ring which you wore, which was large enough for you, and yet, oh, it was horrible, not big enough for one of my fingers." "Would you like me not to wear this ring any more?" Thibault said. "Would you like me to throw it away?" And he began trying to pull it off his fingers, but as it had been too small to go on Agnelette's finger, so now it was too small to be taken off Thibault's. In vain he struggled with it, and tried to move it with his teeth. The ring seemed riveted to his finger for all eternity. Thibault saw that it was no use trying to get rid of it. It was a token of compact between himself and the black wolf, and with a sigh he let his arms fall hopelessly to his sides. "That day," went on Agnelette, "I ran away. I know that I was wrong to do so, but I was no longer mistress of myself after seeing that ring, and more still—" She lifted her eyes as she spoke, looking timidly up at Thibault's hair. Thibault was bareheaded, and by the light of the moon Agnelette could see that it was no longer a single hair that shone red as the flames of hell, but that half the hair on Thibault's head was now of this devil's color. "Oh!" she exclaimed, drawing back. "Thibault, Thibault, what has happened to you since I last saw you?" "Agnelette!" cried Thibault, throwing himself down with his face to the ground and holding his head between his hands. "I could not tell any human creature, not even a priest, what has happened to me since then, but to Agnelette all I can say is, Agnelette, Agnelette, have pity on me, for I have been most unhappy." Agnelette went up to him and took his hands in hers. "Did you love me then? You did love me?" he cried. "What can I do, Thibault?" said the girl with the same sweetness and innocence as before. "I took you at your word, and every time I heard someone knocking at our hut door, I thought it was you come to say to the old grandmother, 'Mother, I love Agnelette, Agnelette loves me, will you give her to me for my wife?' Then, when I went and opened the door and found that it was not you, I used to go into a corner and cry." "And now, Agnelette, now?" "Now," she answered, "now, Thibault, it may seem strange, but in spite of all the terrible tales that are told about you, I have not been really frightened. I was sure that you could not wish any harm to me, and I was walking boldly through the forest, when that dreadful beast from which you saved me suddenly sprang upon me." "But how is it that you are near your old home? Do you not live with your husband?" "We lived together for a while at Vez, but there was no room there for the grandmother, and so I said to my husband, 'The grandmother must be thought of first. I must go back to her. When you wish to see me, you will come.'" "And he consented to that arrangement?" "Not at first, but I pointed out to him that the grandmother is 70 years of age, that if she were only to live another 2 or 3 years, God grant it may be more, it would only be 2 or 3 years of some extra trouble for us, whereas in all probability we had long years of life before us. Then he understood that it was right to give to those that had least." But all the while that Agnelette was giving this explanation, Thibault could think of nothing but that the love she once had for him was not yet dead. "So," said Thibault, "you loved me, and so, Agnelette, you could love me again?" "That is not possible now, because I belong to another." "Agnelette, Agnelette, only say that you love me." "No, Thibault, if I loved you, I should do everything in the world to hide it from you." "And why?" cried Thibault, "why? You do not know my power. I know that I have only a wish or two left, but with your help, by combining these wishes together, I could make you as rich as a queen. We could leave the country, leave France, Europe. There are large countries of which you do not even know the names, Agnelette, called America and India. They are paradises, with blue skies, tall trees, and birds of every kind. Agnelette, say that you will come with me. Nobody will know that we have gone off together, nobody will know where we are, nobody will know that we love one another, nobody will know even that we are alive." "Fly with you, Thibault?" said Agnelette, looking at the wolf leader as if she had but half understood what he said. "Do you forget that I no longer belong to myself? Do you not know that I am married?" "What does that matter?" said Thibault, "if it is I whom you love, and if we can live happily together." "Oh, Thibault, Thibault, what are you saying?" "Listen," went on Thibault, "I am going to speak to you in the name of this world and the next. Do you wish to save me, Agnelette, body and soul? If so, do not resist my pleading. Have pity on me. Come with me. Let us go somewhere together where we shall no longer hear these howlings or breathe this atmosphere of reeking flesh. And if it scares you to think of being a rich grand lady somewhere, then where I can again be Thibault the workman, Thibault poor but beloved, and therefore Thibault happy in his hard work, some place where Agnelette will have no other husband but me." "Ah, Thibault, I was ready to become your wife, and you scorned me." "Do not remember my sins, Agnelette, which have been so cruelly punished." "Thibault, another has done what you were not willing to do. He took the poor young girl, he burdened himself with the poor old blind woman, he gave a name to the one and bread to the other. He had no ambition beyond that of gaining my love. He desired no dowry beyond my marriage vow. Can you think of asking me to return evil for good? Do you dare to suggest that I should leave the one who has given me such proof of his love for the one who has given me proof only of his indifference?" "But what matters still, Agnelette, since you do not love him, and since you do love me?" "Thibault, do not turn and twist my words to make them appear to say what they do not. I said that I still preserved my friendship for you. I never said that I did not love my husband. I should like to see you happy, my friend. Above all, I should like to see you abjure your evil ways and repent of your sins. And last of all, I wish that God may have mercy upon you, and that you may be delivered from that spirit of evil of which you spoke just now. For this I pray night and morning on my knees, but even that I may be able to pray for you, I must keep myself pure. If the voice that supplicates for mercy is to rise to God's throne, it must be an innocent one. Above all, I must scrupulously keep the oath which I swore at his altar." On hearing these decisive words from Agnelette, Thibault again became fierce and morose. "Do you not know, Agnelette, that it is very imprudent of you to speak to me here like that?" "And why, Thibault?" asked the young woman. "We are alone here together, it is dark, and not a man of the open would dare to come into the forest at this hour, and no, the king is not more master in his kingdom than I am here." "I do not understand you, Thibault." "I mean that having prayed, implored, and conjured, I can now threaten." "You threaten?" "What I mean is," continued Thibault, paying no heed to Agnelette's words, "that every word you speak does not excite my love for you more than it rouses my hatred towards him. In short, I mean that it is imprudent of the lamb to irritate the wolf, when the lamb is in the power of the wolf." "I told you, Thibault, before, that I started to walk through the forest without any feeling of fear at meeting you. As I was coming to, I felt a momentary terror, remembering involuntarily what I had heard said about you. But at this moment, Thibault, you will try in vain to make me turn pale." Thibault flung both hands up to his head. "Do not talk like that," he said. "You cannot think what the devil is whispering to me, and what an effort I have to make to resist his voice." "You may kill me if you like," replied Agnelette, "but I will not be guilty of the cowardice which you ask of me. You may kill me, but I shall remain faithful to my husband. You may kill me, but I shall pray to God to help him as I die." "Do not speak his name, Agnelette. Do not make me think about that man." "You can threaten me as much as you like, Thibault, for I am in your hands, but happily he is far from you, and you have no power over him." "And who told you that, Agnelette? Do you not know that, thanks to the diabolical power I possess, and which I can hardly fight against, I am able to strike as well far as near?" "And if I should become a widow, Thibault, do you imagine that I should be vile enough to accept your hand when it was stained with the blood of the one whose name I bear?" "Agnelette," said Thibault, falling on his knees, "Agnelette, save me from committing a further crime." "It is you, not I, who will be responsible for the crime. I can give you my life, Thibault, but not my honor." "Ah!" roared Thibault, "love flies from the heart when hatred enters. Take care, Agnelette, take heed to your husband. The devil is in me, and he will soon speak through my mouth. Instead of the consolation which I had hoped from your love, and which your love refuses, I will have vengeance. Stay my hand, Agnelette, there is yet time. Stay it from cursing, from destroying. If not, Understand that it is not I, but you, who strike him dead. Agnelette, you know now. Agnelette, you do not stop me from speaking? Let it be so then, and let the curse fall on all three of us, you and him and me. Agnelette, I wish your husband to die, and he will die." Agnelette uttered a terrible cry. Then, as if her reason reasserted itself, protesting against this murder at a distance, which seemed impossible to her, she exclaimed, "No, no, you only say that to terrify me, but my prayers will prevail against your maledictions. Go then and learn how heaven answers your prayers. Only if you wish to see your husband again alive, Agnelette, you had better make haste, or you will but stumble against his dead body." Overcome by the tone of conviction with which these last words were pronounced, and yielding to an irresistible feeling of terror, Agnelette, without responding to Thibault, who stood on the further side of the lane with his hand held out and pointing towards Preciamont, set off running in the direction which it seemed to indicate, and soon disappeared into the night as she turned out of sight at the corner of the road. As she passed from his view, Thibault uttered a howl which might have been taken for the howling of a whole pack of wolves, and plunging into the thicket, "Ah, now," he cried aloud to himself, "I am indeed a lost and accursed soul." End of chapter 21. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 22 of The Wolf Leader by Alexandre Dumas, translated by Alfred Allinson, 1852–1929. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 22. Thibault's Last Wish. Urged in her flight by a hideous terror and anxious to reach the village where she had left her husband with all speed possible, Agnelette, for the very reason that she was running so hastily, was forced by her failing breath to pause at intervals along the way. During these short spaces of rest, she endeavored to reason with herself, trying to convince herself of the folly of attaching importance to words which could have no power in themselves, and which were dictated by jealousy and hatred, words which had by now been scattered to the winds. But notwithstanding all her mental arguments, she had no sooner regained her breath than she started off again at the same precipitate pace, for she felt she should know no peace until she had seen her husband again. Best part of her way led through the forest and near the wildest and most solitary enclosures, but she gave no thought to the wolves, which were the terror of every town and village within 10 miles round. Only one fear possessed her, that of coming across her husband's dead body. More than once, as her foot struck against a stone or a branch, her heart stopped beating, and she felt as if her last breath had been drawn, while a sharp cold seemed to enter her very vitals. Her hair stood on end, and her face grew wet with perspiration. At last, at the end of the long path she had been traversing, arched over by the trees, she saw ahead of her a vista of open country lying bathed in the soft silver light of the moon. As she emerged from the gloom into the light, a man who had been concealed behind a bush in the hollow lying between the forest and the open country sprang in front of her and took her in his arms. "Ha, ha, ha, ha!" he said, laughing. "And where are you off to, madame, at this hour of night, and at this pace, too?" Agnelette recognized her husband. "Etienne! Dear, dear Etienne!" cried the young woman, throwing her arms round his neck. "How thankful I am to see you again, and to find you alive and well. Oh, my God, I thank thee!" "What? Did you think, you poor little Agnelette," said Engoulevent, "that Thibault and his wolves had been making their dinner of me?" "Ah, do not even speak of Thibault, Etienne. Let us fly, dear one, fly to where there are houses." The young huntsman laughed again. "Well, now then, you will make all the gossips of Preciamont and Vez declare that a husband is of no use at all, not even to restore his wife's courage." "You are right, Etienne, but although I have just had the courage to come through these great dreadful woods, now that I have you with me and should feel reassured, I tremble with fear, and yet I know not why." "What has happened to you? Come, tell me all about it," said Etienne, giving his wife a kiss. Then Agnelette told him how she had been attacked by the wolf, how Thibault had rescued her from its claws, and what had passed between them afterwards. Engoulevent listened with the greatest attention. "Listen," he said to Agnelette, "I am going to take you home and shut you up carefully with the grandmother, so that no harm may come to you. and then I shall ride over and tell my Lord of Vez where Thibault has taken up his quarters." "Oh, no, no," cried Agnelette, "you would have to ride through the forest, and there is no knowing what danger you might run." "I will make a detour," said Etienne. "I can go round by Croyolles and Value instead of crossing the forest." Agnelette sighed and shook her head, but made no further resistance. She knew that Engoulevent would not give in on this matter, and she reserved her strength wherewith to renew her entreaties when she was once indoors. And in truth the young huntsman only considered that he was doing his duty, for a great battue had been arranged for the next day in a part of the forest on the furthest side from that on which Agnelette had met Thibault. Etienne, therefore, was bound to go without delay and report to his master the whereabouts of the wolf leader. There was not too much of the night left for the work of rearranging for tomorrow's battue. As they drew near Preciamont, Agnelette, who had not spoken for a while, decided that she had, during her silence, amassed a sufficient number of reasons to justify her in beginning her solicitations afresh, which she did with even more earnestness than she had put into her former arguments. She reminded Etienne that Thibault, even though he might be a werewolf, had, so far from hurting her, actually saved her life, and that after all, he had not abused his power when he had her in it, but had allowed her to leave him and rejoin her husband. And after that, to betray where he was to his mortal enemy, the Lord of Vez, was not performing a duty but committing an act of treachery. And Thibault, who would certainly get wind of this treachery, would never under similar circumstances show mercy to anyone again. Agnelette became quite eloquent as she pleaded Thibault's cause, but when marrying Engoulevent, she had made no more secret of her former engagement to the shoemaker than she had of his last interview with him, and however perfect a confidence he had in his wife, Engoulevent was nevertheless not unsusceptible to jealousy. More than that, there existed an old grudge between the two men, ever since the day when Engoulevent had spied out Thibault in his tree, and his boar spear in a neighbouring bush. So he stood his ground, and though listening to Agnelette, continued to walk briskly towards Preciamont. And so, arguing together, and each insisting that he or she was in the right, they came to within a stone's throw of the first forest fences. To protect themselves as far as possible from Thibault's sudden and unexpected assaults, the peasants had instituted patrol parties, who mounted guard at night as in times of war. Etienne and Agnelette were so preoccupied with their discussion that they did not hear the call of "Who goes there?" from the sentinel behind the hedge, and went walking on in the direction of the village. The sentinel, seeing something moving in the darkness, which to his prepossessed imagination appeared to be a monstrous form of some kind, and hearing no answer to his challenge, he prepared to shoot. Looking up, at that moment the young huntsman suddenly caught sight of the sentinel, as the moonlight shone on the barrel of his gun. Calling out, "Friend!" he threw himself in front of Agnelette, flinging his arms round her so as to make a shield of his body. But at the same instant the gun went off, and the unfortunate Etienne, giving one last sigh, fell forward with a groan against the wife he was clasping in his arms. The bullet had pierced his heart. When the people of Preciamont, on hearing the gunshot, came running up to the spot, they found Engoulevent dead, and Agnelette lying unconscious beside her husband. They carried her to her grandmother's, but she only came to her senses to fall into a state of despair which bordered on delirium, and which at last became almost madness. She accused herself of her husband's death, called him by name, begged the invisible spirits which seemed to haunt her, even in the short intervals of slumber, which her excited state of brain made possible, to have mercy upon him. She called Thibault's name, and addressed such heartbroken supplications to him that those about her were moved to tears. By degrees, in spite of the incoherence of her words, the real facts became evident, and it grew to be generally understood that the wolf leader was in some way accountable for the unhappy accident which had caused poor Etienne's death. The common enemy was therefore accused of having cast a spell over the two unfortunate young creatures, and the animosity felt toward the former shoemaker became intensified. In vain doctors were sent for from Villers-Cotterets and Fertemillon. Agnelette became worse and worse, her strength was rapidly failing. Her voice, after the first few days, grew feebler, her breath shorter, although her delirium was as violent as ever, and everything, even the silence on the doctor's part, led to the belief that poor Agnelette would soon follow her husband to the grave. The voice of the old blind woman alone seemed to have any power to allay the fever. When she heard her grandmother speaking, she grew calmer, the haggard staring eyes grew softer and suffused with tears, She would pass her hand over her forehead as if to drive away some haunting thought, and a sorrowful, wandering smile would pass across her lips. One evening, towards night, her slumber seemed to be more agitated and distressed than usual. The hut, feebly lit by a little copper lamp, was in semi-darkness. The grandmother sat by the hearth, with that immobility of countenance under which peasants and savages hide their strongest feelings. At the foot of the bed on which Agnelette lay, so worn and white that, had it not been for the regular rise and fall of her bosom with its troubled breathing, you might have taken her for dead, knelt one of those women whom the Baron was paying to attend upon the widow of his young huntsman engaged in telling her beads. The other was silently spinning with her distaff. All at once the sick woman, who for some minutes past had been shivering at intervals, seemed to be fighting against some horrible dream, and gave a piercing cry of anguish. At that moment the door burst open, a man seemingly encircled by flames rushed into the room, leapt to Agnelette's bed, clasped the dying woman in his arms, pressed his lips upon her forehead, uttering cries of sorrow, then rushing to another door which gave on to the open country, opened it and disappeared. The apparition had come and gone so quickly that it seemed almost like an hallucination, and as if Agnelette were endeavoring to repulse some invisible object as she cried out, "Take him away! Take him away!" But the two watchers had seen the man and had recognized Thibault, and there was a clamoring outside, in the midst of which the name of Thibault could be distinguished. Soon the clamor came nearer to Agnelette's hut, and those who were uttering the cries ere long appeared on the threshold. They were in pursuit of the wolf leader. Thibault had been seen prowling in the neighborhood of the hut, and the villagers, warned of this by their sentinels, had armed themselves with pitchforks and sticks, preparatory to giving him chase. Thibault, hearing of the hopeless condition in which Agnelette was, had not been able to resist his longing to see her once again, and at the risk of what might happen to him, he had passed through the village, trusting to the rapidity of his movements, had opened the door of the hut, and rushed in to see the dying woman. The two women showed the peasants the door by which Thibault had escaped, and like a pack that has recovered the scent, they started afresh on his track with renewed cries and threats. Thibault, it need hardly be said, escaped from them and disappeared in the forest. Agnelette's condition, after the terrible shock given her by Thibault's presence and embrace, became so alarming that before the night was over the priest was sent for. She had evidently now but a few hours longer to live and suffer. Towards midnight the priest arrived, followed by the sacristan carrying the cross, and the choir boys bearing the holy water. These went and knelt at the foot of the bed, while the priest took his place at the head beside Agnelette, and now some mysterious power seemed to reanimate the dying woman. For a long time she spoke in a low voice with the priest, and as the poor child had no need of long prayers for herself, it was certain that she must be praying for another. And who was that other? God, the priest, and Agnelette alone knew. End of chapter 22. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 23 of The Wolf Leader by Alexandre Dumas, translated by Alfred Allinson, 1852 to 1929. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 23. The Anniversary. As soon as Thibault ceased to hear the furious cries of his pursuers behind him, he slackened his pace, and the usual silence again reigning throughout the forest, he paused and sat down on a heap of stones. He was in such a troubled state of mind that he did not recognize where he was, until he began to notice that some of the stones were blackened, as if they had been licked by flames. They were the stones of his own former hearth. Chance had led him to the spot where, a few months previously, his hut had stood. The shoemaker evidently felt the bitterness of the comparison between the peaceful past and this terrible present, for large tears rolled down his cheeks and fell upon the cinders at his feet. He heard midnight strike from the Wagny church clock, then one after the other from the other neighboring village towers. At this moment the priest was listening to Agnelette's dying prayers. "Cursed be the day," cried Thibault, "when I first wished for anything beyond what God chooses to put within the reach of a poor workman. Cursed be the day when the black wolf gave me the power to do evil, for the ill that I have done, instead of adding to my happiness, has destroyed it forever." A loud laugh was heard behind Thibault's back. He turned. There was the black wolf himself, creeping noiselessly along like a dog coming to rejoin its master. The wolf would have been invisible in the gloom but for the flames shot forth from his eyes, which illuminated the darkness. He went round the hearth and sat down facing the shoemaker. "What's this?" he said. "Master Thibault not satisfied? It seems that Master Thibault is difficult to please." "How can I feel satisfied?" said Thibault. "I, who since I first met you have known nothing but vain aspirations and endless regrets. I wished for riches, and here I am in despair at having lost the humble roof of bracken under shelter, of which I could sleep in peace, without anxiety as to the morrow, without troubling myself about the rain or the wind beating against the branches of the giant oaks. I wished for position, and here I am, stoned and hunted down by the lowest peasants, whom formerly I despised. I asked for love, and the only woman who loved me, and whom I loved, became the wife of another, and she is at this moment cursing me as she lies dying, while I, notwithstanding all the power you have given me, can do nothing to help her." "Leave off loving anybody but yourself, Thibault." "Oh, yes, laugh at me, do." "I'm not laughing at you. But you do not cast envious eyes on other people's property before you had set eyes on me?" "Yes, for a wretched buck, of which there are hundreds just as good browsing in the forest." "You thought your wishes were going to stop at the buck, Thibault, but wishes lead on to one another, as the night to the day and the day to the night. When you wished for the buck, you also wished for the silver dish on which it would be served. The silver dish led you on to wish for the servant who carries it and for the carver who cuts up its contents. Ambition is like the vault of heaven. It appears to be bounded by the horizon, but it covers the whole earth. You disdained Agnelette's innocence and went after Madame Poulet's mill. If you had gained the mill, you would immediately have wanted the house of the bailiff Magloire, and his house would have had no further attraction for you, when once you had seen the castle of Montgobert. You are one in your envious disposition with the fallen angel, your master and mine. Only as you were not clever enough to reap the benefit that might have accrued to you from your power of inflicting evil, it would perhaps have been more to your interest to continue to lead an honest life." "Yes, indeed," replied the shoemaker. "I feel the truth of the proverb, evil to him who evil wishes." But he continued, "Can I not become an honest man again?" The wolf gave a mocking chuckle. "My good fellow, the devil can drag a man to hell," he said, "by a single hair. Have you ever counted how many of yours now belong to him?" "No." "I cannot tell you that exactly either, but I know how many you have which are still your own. You have one left. You see, it is long past the time for repentance." "But if a man is lost when but one of his hairs belongs to the devil," said Thibault, "why cannot God likewise save a man in virtue of a single hair?" "Well, try, if that is so." "And besides, when I concluded that unhappy bargain with you, I did not understand that it was to be a compact of this kind." "Oh yes, I know all about the bad faith of you men. Was it no compact then to consent to give me your hairs, you stupid fool? Since men invented baptism, we do not know how to get hold of them, and so in return for any concessions we make them, we are bound to insist on their relinquishing to us some part of their body on which we can lay hands. You gave us the hairs of your head, they are firmly rooted, as you have proved yourself, and will not come away in our grasp. No, no, Thibault, you have belonged to us ever since, standing on the threshold of the door that was once there, you cherished within you thoughts of deceit and violence." "And so," cried Thibault passionately, rising and stamping his foot, "and so I am lost as regards the next world without having enjoyed the pleasures of this?" "You can yet enjoy these." "And how, I pray?" "By boldly following the path that you have struck by chance, and resolutely determining on a course of conduct which you have adopted as yet only in a half-hearted way. In short, by frankly owning yourself to be one of us." "And how am I to do this?" "Take my place." "And what then?" "You will then acquire my power, and you will have nothing left to wish for." "If your power is so great, if it can give you all the riches that I long for, why do you give it up? Do not trouble yourself about me. The master for whom I shall have won a retainer will liberally reward me. And if I take your place, shall I also have to take your form? Yes, in the night time. By day you will be a man again. The nights are long, dark, full of snares. I may be brought down by a bullet from a keeper, or be caught in a trap, and then goodbye riches, goodbye position and pleasure. Not so, for this skin that covers me is impenetrable by iron, lead, or steel. As long as it protects your body, you will be not only invulnerable, but immortal. Once a year, like all werewolves, you will become a wolf again for 24 hours, and during that interval you will be in danger of death like any other animal. I had just reached that dangerous time a year ago today, when we first met." "Ah," said Thibault, "that explains why you feared my Lord Baron's dogs." "When we have dealings with men, we are forbidden to speak anything but the truth and the whole truth. It is for them to accept or refuse." "You have boasted to me of the power that I should acquire. Tell me now in what that power will consist." "It will be such that even the most powerful king will not be able to withstand it, since his power is limited by the human and the possible." "Shall I be rich?" "So rich that you will come in time to despise riches, since by the mere force of your will you will obtain not only what men can only acquire with gold and silver, but also all that superior beings get by their conjurations." "Shall I be able to revenge myself on my enemies?" "You will have unlimited power over everything which is connected with evil." "If I love a woman, will there again be a possibility of my losing her?" "As you will have dominion over all your fellow creatures, you will be able to do with them what you like." "There will be no power to enable them to escape from the trammels of my will?" "Nothing, except death, which is stronger than all." "And I shall only run the risk of death myself on one day out of the 365? "On one day only. During the remaining days nothing can harm you, neither iron, lead, nor steel, neither water nor fire." "And there is no deceit, no trap to catch me in your words?" "None, on my honor as a wolf." "Good," said Thibault. "Then let it be so, a wolf for 24 hours, for the rest of the time the monarch of creation. What am I to do? I am ready." "Pick a holly leaf, tear it in 3 pieces with your teeth, and throw it away from you as far as you can." Thibault did as he was commanded. Having torn the leaf in 3 pieces, he scattered them on the air, and although the night till then had been a peaceful one, there was immediately heard a loud peal of thunder, while a tempestuous whirlwind arose, which caught up the fragments and carried them whirling away with it. "And now, brother Thibault," said the wolf, "take my place, and good luck be with you. As was my case just a year ago, so you will have to become a wolf for 24 hours. You must endeavor to come out of the ordeal as happily as I did, thanks to you, and then you will see realized all that I have promised you. Meanwhile, I will pray the Lord of the Cloven Hoof that he will protect you from the teeth of the Baron's hounds, for, by the devil himself, I take a genuine interest in you, friend Thibault." And then it seemed to Thibault that he saw the black wolf grow larger and taller, that it stood up on its hind legs, and finally walked away in the form of a man, who made a sign to him with his hand as he disappeared. We say, it seemed to him, for Thibault's ideas for a second or two became very indistinct. A feeling of torpor passed over him, paralyzing his power of thought. When he came to himself, he was alone, his limbs were imprisoned in a new and unusual form. He had, in short, become in every respect the counterpart of the black wolf that a few minutes before had been speaking to him. One single white hair on his head alone shone in contrast to the remainder of the sombre colored fur. This one white hair of the wolf was the one black hair which had remained to the man. Thibault had scarcely had time to recover himself when he fancied he heard a rustling among the bushes and the sound of a low, muffled bark. He thought of the Baron and his hounds, and trembled. Thus metamorphosed into the black wolf, he decided that he would not do what his predecessor had done, and wait till the dogs were upon him. It was probably a bloodhound he had heard, and he would get away before the hounds were uncoupled. He made off, striking straight ahead, as is the manner of wolves, and it was a profound satisfaction to him to find that in his new form he had tenfold his former strength and elasticity of limb. "By the devil in his horns!" the voice of the Lord of Vez was now heard to say to his new huntsman a few paces off, "You hold the leash too slack, my lad. You have let the bloodhound give tongue, and we shall never head the wolf back now." "I was in fault, do not deny it, my lord. But as I saw it go by last evening only a few yards from this spot, I never guessed that it would take up its quarters for the night in this part of the wood, and that it was so close to us as all that." "Are you sure it is the same one that has got away from us so often?" "May the bread I eat in your service choke me, my lord, if it is not the same black wolf that we were chasing last year when poor Marcotte was drowned." "I should like finely to put the dogs on its track," said the Baron with a sigh. "My lord has but to give the order, and we will do so. But he will allow me to observe that we have still 2 good hours of darkness before us, time enough for every horse we have to break its legs." "That may be, but if we wait for the day, l'Éveillé, the fellow will have had time to get 10 leagues away." "10 leagues at least," said l'Éveillé, shaking his head. "I have got this cursed black wolf on my brain," added the Baron, "and I have such a longing to have it skinned that I feel sure I shall catch an illness if I do not get hold of it." "Well then, my lord, let us have the dogs out without a moment's loss of time." "You are right, l'Éveillé, go and fetch the hounds." L'Éveillé went back to his horse, that he had tied to a tree outside the wood, and went off at a gallop, and in 10 minutes' time, which seemed like 10 centuries to the Baron, he was back with the whole hunting train. The hounds were immediately uncoupled. "Gently, gently, my lads," said the Lord of Vez. "You forget you are not handling your old, well-trained dogs. If you get excited with these raw recruits, they'll merely kick up a devil of a row, and be no more good than so many turnspits. Let 'em get warmed up by degrees." And indeed the dogs were no sooner loose than 2 or 3 got at once onto the scent of the werewolf and began to give cry, whereupon the others joined them. The whole pack started off on Thibault's track, at first quietly following up the scent, and only giving cry at long intervals, then more excitedly and of more accord, until they had so thoroughly imbibed the odor of the wolf ahead of them, and the scent had become so strong that they tore along, baying furiously and with unparalleled eagerness in the direction of the Ivor coppice. "Well begun is half done," cried the Baron. "You look after the relays, l'Éveillé. I want them ready whenever needed. I will encourage the dogs, and you be on alert, you others," he added, addressing himself to the younger keepers. "We have more than one defeat to avenge, and if I lose this view, halloo, through the fault of anyone among you, by the devil in his horns, he shall be the dog's quarry in place of the wolf." After pronouncing these words of encouragement, the Baron put his horse to the gallop, and although it was still pitch dark and the ground was rough, he kept the animal going at top speed, so as to come up with the hounds, which could be heard giving tongue in the lowlands about Bourg Fontaine. End of chapter 23. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 24 of The Wolf Leader by Alexandre Dumas, translated by Alfred Allinson, 1852–1929. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Chapter 24. Hunting down the werewolf. Thibault had got well ahead of the dogs, thanks to the precaution he had taken of making good his escape at the first note of the bloodhound. For some time he heard no further sound of pursuit, but all at once, like distant thunder, the baying of the hounds reached his ears, and he began to feel some anxiety. He had been trotting, but he now went on at a greater speed, and did not pause till he had put a few more leagues between himself and his enemies. Then he stood still and took his bearings. He found himself on the heights at Montaigu. He bent his head and listened. The dogs still seemed a long way off, somewhere near the Tillet coppice. It required a wolf's ear to distinguish them so far off. Thibault went down the hill again, as if to meet the dogs, then leaving Erneville to the left, he leapt into the little stream which rises there, waded down its course as far as Grimalcourt, dashed into the woods of Lessart-l'Abbesse, and finally gained the forest of Compiègne. He was somewhat reassured to find that in spite of his 3 hours' hard running, the steel-like muscles of his wolf legs were not in the least fatigued. He hesitated, however, to trust himself in a forest which was not so familiar to him as that of Villers-Cotterets. After another dash of a mile or so, he decided that by doubling boldly he would be most likely to put the dogs off the scent. He crossed at a gallop all the stretch of plain between Pierrefonds and Montgobert, took to the woods at the Champ Moutard, came out again at Vauvaudrand, regained the stream by the Saint-Cierus timber floatage, and once more found himself in the forest near Longpont. Unfortunately for him, just as he reached the end of the Route de Pendu, he came across another pack of 20 dogs, which Monsieur de Montbreton's huntsman was bringing up as a relay, for the Baron had sent his neighbor news of the chase. Instantly the hounds were uncoupled by the huntsman as he caught sight of the wolf, for seeing that the latter kept its distance, he feared it would get too far ahead if he waited for the others to come up before loosing his dogs. And now began the struggle between the werewolf and the dogs in very earnest. It was a wild chase, which the horses, in spite of their skilled riders, had great difficulty in following, a chase over plains, through woods, across heaths, pursued at a headlong pace. As the hunt flew by, it appeared and disappeared like a flash of lightning across a cloud, leaving behind a whirlwind of dust, and a sound of horns and cries which Echo had hardly time to repeat. It rushed over hill and dale, through torrents and bogs, and over precipices, as if horses and dogs had been winged like hippogriffs and chimeras. The Baron had come up with his huntsmen riding at their head, and almost riding on the tails of his dogs, his eye flashing, his nostrils dilated, exciting the pack with wild shouts and furious blasts, digging his spurs into his horse's side whenever an obstacle of any kind caused it to hesitate for a single instant. The black wolf on his side still held on at the same rapid pace, although sorely shaken at hearing the fresh pack in full pursuit only a short way behind him. Just as he had got back to the forest, he had not lost an inch of ground. As he retained to the full all his human consciousness, it seemed to him impossible, as he still ran on, that he should not escape in safety from this ordeal. He felt that it was not possible for him to die before he had taken vengeance for all the agony that others had made him suffer, before he had known those pleasures that had been promised him, above all, for at this critical moment his thoughts kept on running on this, before he had gained Agnelette's love. At moments he was possessed by terror, at others by anger. He thought at times that he would turn and face this yelling pack of dogs, and forgetting his present form, scatter them with stones and blows. Then, an instant after, feeling mad with rage, deafened by the death knell the hounds were ringing in his ears, he fled, he leaped, he flew with the legs of a deer, with the wings of an eagle. But his efforts were in vain. He might run, leap, almost fly. The sounds of death still clung to him, and if for a moment they became more distant, it was only to hear them a moment after nearer and more threatening still. But still the instinct of self-preservation did not fail him, and still his strength was undiminished. Only if by ill luck he were to come across other relays, he felt that it might give way. So he determined to take a bold course, so as to outdistance the dogs, and to get back to his lairs, where he knew his ground and hoped to evade the dogs. He therefore doubled for the second time. He first ran back to Puiseux, then skirted past Viviers, regained the forest of Compiègne, made a dash into the forest of Largue, returned and crossed the Aisne and Attichy, and finally got back to the forest of Villers-Cotterets at the lowlands of Argent. He trusted in this way to baffle the strategical plans of the Lord of Vez, who had no doubt posted his dogs at various likely points. Once back in his old quarters, Thibault breathed more freely. He was now on the banks of the Ourcq, between Norry and Trouenne, where the river runs at the foot of deep rocks on either side. He leapt up onto a sharp-pointed crag overhanging the water, and from this high vantage ground he sprang into the waves below, then swam to a crevice at the base of the rock from which he had leapt, which was situated rather below the ordinary level of the water, and here, at the back of this cave, he waited. He had gained at least 3 miles upon the dogs, and yet scarcely another 10 minutes had elapsed when the whole pack arrived and stormed the crest of the rock. Those who were leading, mad with excitement, did not see the gulf in front of them, or else, like their quarry, they thought they would leap safely into it, for they plunged, and Thibault was splashed, far back as he was hidden, by the water that was scattered in every direction as they fell into it one by one. Less fortunate, however, and less vigorous than he was, they were unable to fight against the current, and after vainly battling with it, they were borne along out of sight before they had even got scent of the werewolf's retreat. Overhead he could hear the tramping of the horses' feet, the baying of the dogs that were still left, the cries of men, and above all these sounds, dominating the other voices, that of the Baron as he cursed and swore. When the last dog had fallen into the water and been carried away like the others, he saw, thanks to a bend in the river, that the huntsmen were going down it, and persuaded that the Baron, whom he recognized at the head of his hunting train, would only do this with the intention of coming up it again, he determined not to wait for this, and left his hiding place. Now swimming, now leaping with agility from one rock to the other, at times wading through the water, he went up the river to the end of the Crenne coppice. Certain that he had now made a considerable advance to his enemies, he resolved to get to one of the villages near and run in and out among the houses, feeling sure that they would not think of coming after him there. He thought of Preciamont. If any village was well known to him, it was that, and then at Preciamont he would be near Agnelette. He felt that this neighborhood would put fresh vigor into him, and would bring him good fortune, and that the gentle image of the innocent girl would have some influence on his fate. So he started off in that direction. It was now 6 o'clock in the evening. The hunt had lasted nearly 15 hours, and wolf, dogs, and huntsmen had covered 50 leagues at least. When at last, after circling round by Manereux and Oigny, the black wolf reached the borders of the heath by the lane of Ham, the sun was already beginning to sink, and shedding a dazzling light over the flowery plain. The little white and pink flowers scented the breeze that played caressingly around them. The grasshopper was singing in its little house of moss, and the lark was soaring up towards heaven, saluting the eye with its song as 12 hours before it had saluted the morn. The peaceful beauty of nature had a strange effect on Thibault. It seemed enigmatical to him that nature could be so smiling and beautiful, while anguish such as his was devouring his soul. He saw the flowers and heard the insects and the birds, and he compared the quiet joy of this innocent world with the horrible pangs he was enduring, and asked himself whether, after all, notwithstanding all the new promises that had been made him by the devil's envoy, he had acted any more wisely in making this second compact than he had in making the first. He began to doubt whether he might not find himself deceived in the one as he had been in the other. As he went along a little footpath nearly hidden under the golden broom, he suddenly remembered that it was by this very path that he had taken Agnelette home on the first day of their acquaintance, the day when, inspired by his good angel, he had asked her to be his wife. The thought that thanks to this new compact he might be able to recover Agnelette's love revived his spirits, which had been saddened and depressed by the sight of the universal happiness around him. He heard the church bells at Preciamont ringing in the valley below. Its solemn, monotonous tones recalled the thought of his fellow men to the black wolf, and of all he had to fear from them. So he ran boldly on across the fields to the village, where he hoped to find a refuge in some empty building. As he was skirting the little stone wall of the village cemetery, he heard a sound of voices approaching along the road he was in. He could not fail to meet whoever they might be who were coming towards him, if he himself went on. It was not safe to turn back, as he would have to cross some rising ground, whence he might easily be seen. So there was nothing left for it but to jump over the wall of the cemetery, and with a bound he was on the other side. This graveyard, as usual, adjoined the church. It was uncared for and overgrown with tall grass, while brambles and thorns grew rankly in places. The wolf made for the thickest of these bramble bushes. He found a sort of ruined vault, whence he could look out without being seen, and he crept under the branches and hid himself inside. A few yards away from him was a newly dug grave. Within the church could be heard the chanting of the priests, the more distinctly that the vault must at one time have communicated by a passage with the crypt. Presently the chanting ceased, and the black wolf, who did not feel quite at ease in the neighborhood of a church, and thought that the road must now be clear, decided that it was time to start off again and to find a safer retreat than the one he had fled to in his haste. But he had scarcely got his nose outside the bramble bush when the gate of the cemetery opened, and he quickly retreated again to his hole, in great trepidation as to who might now be approaching. The first person he saw was a child dressed in a white alb, and carrying a vessel of holy water. He was followed by a man in a surplice, bearing a silver cross, and after the latter came a priest, chanting the psalms for the dead. Behind these were 4 peasants carrying a bier covered with a white pall, over which were scattered green branches and flowers, and beneath the sheet could be seen the outline of a coffin. A few villagers from Preciamont wound up this little procession. Although there was nothing unusual in such a sight as this, seeing that he was in a cemetery and that the newly dug grave must have prepared him for it, Thibault nevertheless felt strangely moved as he looked on. Although the slightest movement might betray his presence and bring destruction upon him, he anxiously watched every detail of the ceremony. The priest having blessed the newly made grave, the peasants laid down their burden on an adjoining hillock. It is the custom in our country, when a young girl or young married woman dies in the fullness of her youth and beauty, to carry her to the graveyard in an open coffin, with only a pall over her, so that her friends may bid her a last farewell, her relations give her a last kiss. Then the coffin is nailed down, and all is over. An old woman, led by some kind hand, for she was apparently blind, went up to the coffin to give the dead one a last kiss. The peasants lifted the pall from the still face, and there lay Agnelette. A low groan escaped from Thibault's agonized breast, and mingled with the tears and sobs of those present. Agnelette, as she lay there so pale in death, wrapped in an ineffable calm, appeared more beautiful than when in life, beneath her wreath of forget-me-nots and daisies. As Thibault looked upon the poor dead girl, his heart seemed suddenly to melt within him. It was he, as he had truly realized, who had really killed her, and he experienced a genuine and overpowering sorrow, the more poignant since for the first time for many long months he forgot to think of himself, and thought only of the dead woman, now lost to him forever. As he heard the blows of the hammer knocking the nails into the coffin, as he heard the earth and stones being shoveled into the grave and falling with a dull thud onto the body of the only woman he had ever loved, a feeling of giddiness came over him. The hard stones, he thought, must be bruising Agnelette's tender flesh, so fresh and sweet but a few days ago, and only yesterday still throbbing with life, and he made a movement as if to rush out on the assailants and snatch away the body, which dead must surely belong to him, since living it had belonged to another. But the grief of the man overcame this instinct of the wild beast at bay. A shudder passed through the body hidden beneath its wolfskin. Tears fell from the fierce blood-red eyes, and the unhappy man cried out, "O God, take my life! I give it gladly, if only by my death I may give back life to her whom I killed." The words were followed by such an appalling howl that all who were in the cemetery fled, and the place was left utterly deserted. Almost at the same moment, the hounds, having recovered the scent, came leaping in over the wall, followed by the Baron, streaming with sweat as he rode his horse, which was covered with foam and blood. The dogs made straight for the bramble bush, and began worrying something hidden there. "Halloo! halloo! halloo!" cried the Lord of Vez in a voice of thunder, as he leapt from his horse, not caring if there was anyone or not to look after it, and drawing out his hunting knife, he dashed towards the vault. Forcing his way through the hounds, he found them fighting over a fresh and bleeding wolf-skin, but the body had disappeared. There was no mistake as to its being the skin of the werewolf that they had been hunting, for with the exception of one white hair, it was entirely black. What had become of the body? No one ever knew. Only as from this time forth Thibault was never seen again. It was generally believed that the former sabot maker and no other was the werewolf. Furthermore, as the skin had been found without the body, and as from the spot where it was found a peasant reported to have heard someone speak the words, "O God, take my life, I give it gladly, if only by my death I may give back life to her whom I have killed," the priest declared openly that Thibault, by reason of his sacrifice and repentance, had been saved. And what added to the consistency of belief in this tradition was, that every year on the anniversary of Agnelette's death, up to the time when the monasteries were all abolished at the Revolution, a monk from the Abbey of Premonstratensian at Bourg-Fontaine, which stands half a league from Précamont, was seen to come and pray beside her grave. Such is the history of the Black Wolf, as it was told me by old Mocquet, my father's keeper. End of The Wolf Leader, by Alexandre Dumas, translated by Alfred Allinson, 1852 to 1929. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia.